without further ado, let me hand you over to Adam Naylor, the chair of the Churches Trust for Cumbria.
Good morning and welcome to the Caring for Cumbria Churches Conference. I am at the historic and beautiful parish church in Kendal, where we had planned to hold this conference. Initially last April and then this April. But because of the COVID pandemic, this of course has not been possible. Conducting the conference virtually, however, has given us the added benefit of being able to welcome a greater number of participants, not just from Cumbria, but from throughout the United Kingdom. The Churches Trust for Cumbria exists to help incumbents and congregations of all denominations with their church buildings. We provide advice and help on all aspects of managing a church. Repair and maintenance, of course, but also subjects such as tourism, welcoming visitors, sustainability and diversification. To this end, we have run the Caring for Cumbrian Churches project, of which this conference is the culmination, and which has been generously funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. During the morning, you will be able to see excerpts from some of the short films that we have produced as part of this project. I would like to thank the National Lottery Heritage Fund for their support. And I would also like to thank the distinguished speakers and contributors who are joining us today. I must also make special mention of the Trust's Development Officer, Jayne, who has delivered the splendid and groundbreaking project for us. It is still too early to predict the long-term effects of the pandemic on our church buildings. I'm sure some of our speakers will touch on that. Our Trust remains committed to trying to secure viable futures for our churches. And I know that this conference and the wider project of which it is part will contribute substantially to that end. I hope you enjoy the morning.
Thank you, Adam. Right, let's talk about the aim of the day. As Adam said there, this event has been organised as part of the Caring for Cumbria's Churches project, which is supported by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. Now, today is about providing practical guidance on assessing the value and significance of church buildings. There'll also be advice on their use and their future sustainability as places of worship, heritage assets, and as hubs of the local community. Right, time for our first item of the day. We all know that our church buildings are important for so many reasons, as places of worship, for their architectural significance, and for their potential to support and bring communities together. But we have never been able to truly measure that importance until now. I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Lord Richard Inglewood, Vice President of the National Churches Trust, which has published the House of Good report, a report that quantifies the economic and social value of all church buildings to the UK. Not just the bricks and mortar, but, as the Trust says, the welfare and well-being they create in our communities. Richard, welcome.
Morning, Emma. Very
Good
nice.
morning. The findings of that report are of huge significance, aren't they? Not least the headline figure that churches contribute £12.4 billion to our communities. That is a staggering figure, isn't it? Was that a surprise to you when you found that out?
I'm not sure it was surprise in the sense I wasn't at all clear what the figure might be. But we're living in a world where increasingly it is now recognised that a whole number of essentially non-monetary aspects are delivered by organisations such as churches. and that it's important in order to get the balance in the way society works that these are properly evaluated. Hence, techniques have been evolving to do that. And in this instance, as you say, the headline figure is that churches are contributing about £12.4 billion a year to the wider good of society. And what is interesting is that this, in fact, is a conservative analysis. There's quite a lot of debate about the methodology of these things, but this is a conservative interpretation of what we found.
Which is staggering. Can you just give us a bit of a breakdown of the figures? I mean, are you able to, because I think that averages at around £300,000 per church, doesn't it?
Yes.
The 12.4 billion. Are you able to give us a bit more detail about how, how that breaks down?
Yes. As you say, it's an average figure of about 300,000 a church, but in fact, the reality is that the spectrum is quite wide, and there are some that are doing a very great deal more, and some which, for really reasons of location, will almost certainly be doing less, but they're not less valuable. What the analysis shows is that if you divide what is delivered by churches into two bits, you can break down the way in which it's explained. First of all, there's about £2.5 million worth a year of what's called market value and replacement cost to what they're doing. That's to say, the actual value that's contributed, put into the community by running this church and carrying out repairs. Secondly, there is what you might call the replacement cost of the community and social services, i.e. food banks, youth groups, etc., which are delivered through the churches. And finally, there's about £850 million worth of volunteers' time, which if it wasn't carried out by volunteers, somebody else would have to do. Then on top of that, what you might call the edge of the halo are the non-market or social well-being values, which represent, according to Start Life, who carry out the work, about £165 million worth of well-being value actually to the volunteers themselves, just under £8.5 billion worth of well-being value to people who benefit from all these social community services that are carried out in them, and about £1.5 billion worth of well-being to those who are in the congregation and attend the services. It's a pretty big figure.
Indeed, isn't it just? I mean, they are huge figures and, wide-ranging in terms of the areas they cover. We do seem to live in an age, don't we, where stats and figures are crucial to define our rationale for existence. With that in mind, I think some might say that commissioning a report like this seemed like an obvious thing to do, and yet no one had done it before. It's important to kind of stress that. This really is a very new discovery, isn't it?
It is. It's certainly a novel development and a good one. I believe, says I modestly, was one of the people who was behind doing it. Another built heritage organisation I'm involved with had done it for their particular sector. And it is interesting. And in fact, it's exactly the same approach to this problem as environmentalists and climate changers are using to measure the problems that are being posed in those sectors. The economic value of the intangibles, which was previously not really capable of being measured in economic terms, is now being measured that way. And it's coming up with some very interesting conclusions.
Yes, absolutely. Just take us back to you were one of, as you said, one of those who came up with the idea. What was it that initially gave you the idea to commission this report in the first place?
Well, my input was to suggest Claire Walker that something that we had been doing on the Historic Houses Association to do with historic houses would be appropriate in the context of churches, because there is an enormous amount of wealth, for want of a better way of putting it, that is generated by these places, just as we've seen in the cases of the churches, which doesn't actually reflect necessarily immediately back to the person who has caused them to come about. And it then has implications for who pays for what. But the crucial thing to realize is that the people who are making the money out of churches may not, by which gaining the value, may not be the people who are paying for it. It's as simple as that.
Yeah. And how important do you think it is to have these figures in this day and age, to have these figures to fall back on, to be able to, justify and also look forward as well?
While as an individual, I'm always a bit unhappy about reducing everything to monetary value, even if you're only using it as an instrument to measure. The reality of it is, in a world where there is competition for resources and so on, it is important to have an idea, not only an accurate idea, but one that makes sense. And as I said, the figure of 12.4 billion is almost certainly an underestimate, but deliberately the figures were produced in a conservative form.
It is quite an extraordinary figure. The National Churches Trust calls itself the charity for people who love church buildings. And of course, church buildings have been facing big challenges for some time, but perhaps none more so than in the last 12 months or so, of course, with the pandemic. Now that you have these findings from this report, then, what are you hoping to achieve, looking forward to the future? What do you hope to achieve from these?
Well, the first thing to appreciate is National Churches Trust is, yes, it's keen on church buildings, but it's also keen on church buildings in the sense that they are delivering all these other good things. It originally began as simply an architectural focused charity, but in fact, you can't decouple that from the other things that are going on. Therefore, we've got to make the case that the amount of support that is directed towards churches, which is derisory in general terms, should be enhanced, however that might be done. And so there is lobbying. That's not merely lobbying directly on government. It is persuading people and philanthropists that these things matter, and individuals that these things matter. And the National Churches Trust, it has a website, and it produces a newsletter and carries out work like this, so that we can take forward the long-term sustainability of church buildings and churches, not only Anglican ones, but non-conformist, Roman Catholic as well, for the good of the whole society, because they are hubs from which, in many instances, a great deal of good things emanate.
And I guess, it's all about, knowledge is power, having these figures now. And you quite rightly say, we don't want everything to come back to money, but of course it is a competitive world when it comes to getting the funding and the support as well from the general public. And having these figures does give you some firepower with that, doesn't it? It does really justify.
Absolutely. You can't be simply accused of making it up as you go along. Here is some hard nuts and bolts evidence of what in fact is going on in reality, and that we're not simply a load of woolly-headed romantics.
And do you see reports like this where you come up with those kind of hard figures and the real statistics? And do you see that as being one of the tools going forward for churches right around the country in terms of getting more of these statistics and doing these reports regularly in the future?
I'm sure there will be a kind of longitudinal approach to this, and over time it will evolve. Of course, it's worth remembering that everyone else who is slightly scrabbling over the same pot of money in the world will be producing similar things. And that's equally, I think the methodology will get more sophisticated. And I think that's actually going to be to the advantage of, amongst other things, churches.
Yeah, indeed. And we, of course, here are preaching to the converted in many ways to our audience here today. But you need, as an organisation, you need the findings of this report to really emanate to a wider audience, don't you? To be spread the word. That's right.
In two ways. First of all, to the specific people who are charged with looking at these things in society, but equally, and this is often forgotten, it's very important to have a wide constituency of support across society in order to bring about changes of direction in policy. And this is one of the things that I think the National Churches Trust is well placed to try and help mobilise. But we're part of a wider team, if you see what I mean, churches rather than simply ourselves.
Absolutely. And I wanted to talk about the National Churches Trust as a whole, because for those people who aren't necessarily very familiar with its work, just give us an outline of the kind of work that the National Churches Trust does, and also the support it offers, if you may.
Well, it has some funds which it can give away, and does give away. And I think it's given away about £14 million, if my memory is right, over the last 10 years. But everyone will know that by itself is insufficient. So we're a pressure group doing our bit of lobbying on government to try and increase government support in this direction, which compared to a number of countries is really rather small, and which had been on the decline, unfortunately. So we've got to try and change that. And it's also, for want of a better way, a focal point for example, the Cumbria Churches Trust, take it more widely on a national canvas to try and generate interest in, as I said, and political support for the things we care about.
Yeah. Indeed, thank you. And for people, we are having a couple of questions coming through about how they can access this report. So if people want to go, go and read this report in more detail, just tell us, Richard, where they should head to.
Well, the first place they should go to is the website. And if you go to the National Church Trust website, I've actually got a hard copy in front of me, but I think you can download it. And the most recent newsletter and information. That's a good point.
And all the details are there. I beg your pardon.
Sorry.
No, I was going to say all the details are there on that website of the reports. And actually,
I must admit I haven't checked it, but I'm told they are.
Yes, I'm sure. I think they are. I think you are right. And in terms of the 12.4 billion that people are, someone was asking, just kind of go over the headline of that. Can you just tell us again that 12.4 billion? What exactly does that refer to? That figure?
Right. If I can, I'll try and be short and clear. £2.5 billion worth is what is called market value and replacement costs. And that represents 1.4 direct economic value created by the running, staffing and hiring out of church buildings. The next component of this is 200 million, which is replacement cost of social and community services like food banks, youth groups, mental health services. And the third component is 850 million pounds, replacement for the cost of the volunteers' time. So that's what what you call the market value and replacement cost component of the 12.4. The other bit, 10 billion, is 165 million pounds worth of well-being is achieved by the volunteers for themselves. 8.3 billion pounds is the value of the services to the people who benefit from the various social and community services in well-being. And finally, there's about £1.5 billion, which is the well-being value to those who attend church services. That's how it's been analysed.
Quite extraordinary. Thank you so much for that, going over that, Richard. And that is the House of Good report. We've had a question that was called the House of Good report.
Good. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed for that. We have got links going into the chat for anyone who wants to access that House of Good report. So if you head to the chat, if you want the direct link. And for anyone who would like to know more about the National Churches Trust and their work and grants, we will be sending out all the relevant information in an email after this event. We will be returning to Richard in a few minutes to take some more questions on the Q&A. So if you do have a question for Richard or our next guest, Trevor, please do get them in now or over the next few minutes. The Q&A is down the bottom right of the screen. Richard, for now, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right, our next guest is Trevor Cooper, Chair of the Historic Religious Buildings Alliance, or the HRBA, which is a group within the Heritage Alliance. The HRBA brings together those working for a secure future for historic religious buildings. It produces a free monthly e-newsletter full of information for anyone interested in historic religious buildings, and you can sign up on their website for that. Now, Trevor's knowledge on ecclesiastical heritage is extensive. He's also engaged in research and policy making on the future of church buildings. Now, when looking back over the past 2 centuries, Trevor argues that the trends that got us to where we are today are not new, but the challenges that we face in the here and now are huge and unique. Trevor, welcome. Good morning. Over to you.
Emma, thank you very much for that introduction. I must say I can hardly wait to hear myself speak. Can you just confirm, Emma, that my slides are showing?
Your slides are showing loud and clear. Yep, they look perfect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, no one here needs me to tell you that many people are worried about the future of historic churches and chapels, especially those in rural areas such as Cumbria. There's a lack of people and there's a lack of money. But when you think about that, it's rather odd. Our great-great-grandparents managed to look after these buildings, so why should we struggle? We're much richer than they were, and there are more of us. Why is it all so difficult? And it turns out to understand why things are so difficult now, we need to take the long view. And to see this, let's go back nearly 200 years to the 1840s. So my first slide shows the number of Methodist chapels in Great Britain, and the date ranges from 1851 on the left of the graph to 2010 on the right. And you can see straight away how the number of Methodist chapels rose from about 9,100 in 1851 to more than 14,000 in 1932. Now, this was absolutely typical. Throughout the 19th century, there was a huge concern to build more churches to meet the needs of a growing population, particularly in industrial cities. Furthermore, there was real competition between denominations who often built ahead of actual need to get in first. And as a result, there was overbuilding. Too many chapels, too many churches. And worse still, this was a period when church going as a percentage of the population was starting to decline. At first, this was masked by population growth, but by the late 19th century, people were noticing that churches seemed not to be as full as they used to be. So as a result of competitive overbuilding and a decline in church going, by the time the various Methodist groups have merged in the 1930s, they had far too many chapels, often more than one in the same village. Notice how quickly numbers then fell, down to fewer, 5,100, fewer than they had in 1851. And you get exactly a similar picture for other free churches, the Baptists and the Congregationalists. And all of us would have noticed how many closed chapels there are in villages. Now do bear that picture in mind: a rapid rise in the 19th century, a very rapid fall in the mid-20th century onwards, as we compare with the Church of England. Right, so this second graph has two bits of information. Time is along the bottom as before, going from about 1800 up to 2003, 2 centuries. The data goes further back, which is why I've started earlier. Let's start by looking at the yellow dots. These are the combined industrial dioceses of Manchester and Blackburn. Exactly as you'd expect, there was huge growth in the number of churches as these towns and cities expanded, and then a drop in the mid-20th century as people realized they had too many buildings. Many of these have been pulled down. They weren't buildings of any great merit. Note, though, that the drop is nowhere near as steep as for Methodist chapels. All the free churches have been much more drastic in cutting back on their number of buildings than the Church of England. Now look at the blue dots, which is for the rural diocese of Hereford. And here there's a more muted pattern. Some churches were built during the 19th century in market towns, and some chapels of ease in the countryside. Well, the chapels of ease have now largely gone, particularly in the Midlands and south of England. Chapels of ease have largely gone, and we're back to having about the same number of churches in rural areas as we started. What has now changed is that medieval buildings are coming under real pressure. And to understand why, we need to look at the Church of England in more detail since about 1970. So this is the graph of all-age Sunday attendance in rural dioceses since 1968. I've set the starting figure at an arbitrary 100. And by the end point in 2015, attendance had dropped to 47, more than half a drop. I checked the figures for Cumbria before I came online, and the percentage drop there was down to 43%, from 23,000 on Sunday to 10,000 on Sunday. The average current rate of loss is between 1% and 1.5% per annum, depending on which attendance measure you use. Obviously, there are large numbers of growing churches all over the country, but the average is a drift downwards. Now let me add a graph of the number of churches over the same period, also set to the same arbitrary figure of 100 to start with. And you will immediately see the point. The number of churches supported by these congregations has hardly changed, whilst the people paying for these buildings has roughly halved in the past 50 years. And Cumbria is spot on target here with Diocese of Carlisle, spot on target with a figure of 90 for the number of churches. And let me throw in one more graph to the same slide, which shows the number of stipendiary, that's in effect salaried clergy. And I think this graph speaks for itself. Each clergy person is having to serve more churches, often rushing around from church to church on a Sunday. So what's the effect of all this overbuilding and closure and the decline in churchgoing? We can see this in the next slide, which may be the most important slide I show you. It shows the average number of people per Church of England church building in 1851, when there were 217, and 150 years later in 2006, when there were just 60, and since then it's dropped to around about 48. So on average, not always, but often, Church of England congregations are rattling around in a much larger space than they need, and not surprisingly, have been starting to think how the space may be better used. For Methodists and Baptists, the change is less extreme as they've been quicker to close their churches. For Roman Catholics, it's completely different. Much larger numbers to start with and a smaller percentage drop, but I won't have time to talk about that. Well, all these are very long-term trends whose effects we're living with today. But it turns out that for the Church of England, there were two very definite moments which matter in understanding today's problems. Until 1868, great-great-grandparents' time, the repair of Church of England churches was funded out of local taxation, called the church rate. The more land you owned, or the bigger your house, the more you paid. It was compulsory, and obviously it bore some ability, relation to ability to pay. Compulsory church rates survived until 1868. After that, churches could still send out a rates bill, but no one was obliged to pay. And though not much research has been done on that, my feeling is that people didn't. Suddenly, the number of people in the congregation and their wealth started to matter, and this was new. The small rural communities became a huge burden. I think we're still living with the consequences. The second distinct moment or start of a moment of change was in 1936. Until then, a Church of England vicar was paid, in rural areas particularly, at least partially, was paid from a local tax called tithe. From 1936 onwards, there was a complex interim arrangement, and that had faded away by the 1960s and 70s. So it's only within living memory in many parishes that vicars have had to be paid from the pockets of the congregation. So Church of England buildings and the ministers to provide services in them have relied for most of their history, not on people deciding individually whether to opt in, but on one form or another of compulsory tax, based largely on land and property holdings. And that's now gone, obviously. They now rely entirely on voluntary giving. Of course, every other religious group in Britain relies on the voluntary principle, but they choose when and where to build based on their resources and needs. Other religious groups haven't inherited ancient buildings in virtually every village in England. So the long view explains a lot. Our great-great-grandparents were looking after these buildings at a time of rising population, when rural Church of England churches were largely funded by local taxation. And our grandfathers and grandmothers began closing churches, picking the low-hanging fruit. All this is rather discouraging for us. Too many buildings and a reliance on donations from congregations in decline. Church of England buildings, once dependent on local taxation, now having to struggle with voluntary money. Does the long view give any grounds for hope? Well, yes. To give one example, from the late 1970s, more than 40 years ago, the government has shown a willingness to step in, starting with repair grants, moving on to VAT grants, and most recently, investing a considerable sum of money in the Taylor pilot. and we must all hope that some of his recommendations are taken forward. Perhaps more interestingly, they're not more important, but more interestingly, the long view also shows us that attitudes can change. Until the 1960s, it was against the rules of the Church of England to have plays, feasts, or suppers in a church building. Yet 60 years later, this cartoon will immediately be understood by everyone here, representing a huge shift in attitudes, both amongst those who care for church buildings and the general public. I'll let you look at this for a moment to take it in. So the long view gives hope, and we must all do what we can to press for appropriate government backing. And I think each of us in different ways must do our best to harness this change in attitudes. And the long view certainly makes clear that the way we deal with the problem of historic churches and chapels will have to be new, and it may be difficult. Thanks, Emma.
Trevor, thank you. That was fascinating to get that long view and also to put the current situation in context. Thank you very much indeed. Right, we're going to open the floor up to questions now for Trevor and for Lord Inglewood. So please do use the Q&A function for that, which is down the bottom right of your screen. And if you have your question, if your question is specifically for Richard or for Trevor, just type that at the start of the question so it's clear. Richard, we've got one that's come in, which is a very interesting one, saying, can we use that model that was used in the House of Good Report to calculate the value of individual churches? So the person is saying the value of our church. Is that possible?
Certainly technically possible. Whether it's in fact quite the right way to go about it, I wouldn't be sure. But it's certain that the methodologies exist, but whether you're then taking an individual thing in isolation is going to statistically impugn the outcome, I don't know. But it may be Trevor could help with that, because I must say I was very impressed by a degree of expertise which was way over my head there, and I found it very interesting. So does he think it would be something that might be worth doing?
That's way outside my my expertise, I'm afraid. I think it'd be worth finding a way of doing it.
Well, let me jump in there, gentlemen, if I may, because Eddie from the National Churches Trust has said that they are looking at that, and they're looking at producing an easy-to-use calculator. So he's just given that as an answer. I mean, presumably that could be really interesting if individual churches were able to use this, to use a formula and an easy-to-use calculator. I mean, how useful could that be for church by churches? And I'll put that to both of you, Richard first, but then I'll ask Trevor that afterwards, if I may.
I think it could be. As I think I said in my opening remarks, there's a very wide range of value that's created from different church buildings. What I'm not sure about is methodologically whether you can simply reduce the wide statistical basis which averages things out with a degree of precision to local ones. You may be able to. It's not necessarily a worthless exercise, but it may be you want to be a bit careful about using it boldly. Yeah.
Trevor, any reflections on that?
I think there's huge variation in size of church, and I need to be quite cautious about picking out the plums.
Okay, thank you. Just moving on to a question. I know, Trevor, you said you hadn't got time to deal with the Roman Catholic side of things and the churches, the Roman Catholic churches. I was intrigued if you might just be able to touch a bit on that, though. We've had Eddie again has said a goodly number of Roman Catholic 19th century churches in inner cities, so Salford, Liverpool, for example, have also been closing in recent years as Roman Catholic populations have moved elsewhere. I know you didn't have time it's a completely different situation, isn't it, you were saying, but are you able just to give us a little bit of detail on that?
Yes, it's a completely different picture because of historical prejudices and disadvantages against Roman Catholics. They were slow to build, and they carried on building steadily right through the 19th century, right through the 20th century. And it was only about the 1980s that they started to close their buildings. But more importantly still, for historical reasons, they have far fewer churches. Though the number of attendees is very approximately the same as Church of England, they have about 5 times fewer churches. And the way they run things, as most people will know, is to have multiple services on Saturday and Sunday. And those services, so they're working their churches very hard indeed. So there is has been historically less pressure on those buildings. Historical reasons, some of the buildings, number of the buildings are of less historical interest, so they're easier to close when need be. So a complete different picture.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, thank you for that. Another one, Trevor, for you. This is from Clive. What hopes do you have for rural churches in light of Taylor findings? He says.
I think one person asked, what is the Taylor report? So quickly, the government set up a body run by Bernard Taylor to report on Anglican churches, Church of England churches. It made a number of recommendations, so I'll mention in a moment. And the government then decided that this was important enough to do a trial, because Bernard Taylor, being a scientist, said, this is a hypothesis, let's test it. And the trial was run in Manchester and Suffolk and finished a year or so ago. The recommendations were various, but they included things like helping churches with increasing their local engagement, local social engagement, and finding money for small repairs. And he also recommended, though this wasn't tested, finding a pot of money for major capital repairs. The pilots came back very positive. These interventions for minor repairs and for helping churches engage more locally were definitely effective. We haven't, of course, tested the capital pot. Now, we are in very strange times with the pandemic and general finances of the country. Who knows what's going to happen next? But a lot of people working in this area are hoping very much that the government can be persuaded to at least do something along these lines.
Okay, thank you, Trevor. And another one, Robert has given us a reflection, really, saying, I wonder if availability and cost of trades is also a significant part of this problem, particularly in rural areas. I mean, maybe you might have something, just a reflection on that.
Is that addressed to Trevor or to me, or both?
Sorry, that was, well, actually, both, if you've both got a reflection. Richard, I'll ask you first, then we'll go to Trevor on that.
Yeah, it certainly appears to be in certain circumstances.
Trevor?
You know, I'm being thick here, Emma. What is the cost of trade?
I think in terms of, I mean, repair, maintenance,
skill crafts,
that kind of thing.
Well, I'm not expert on this, but I'm told that there is a significant problem with traditional craftspeople. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Beth has got one. How do we get the message over to the wider community that the churches aren't supported nationally? As I think that, he says, as I think that memory of compulsory payments still lingers in non-church goers' perceptions of how churches are funded. That's a very interesting point, isn't it? Again, Richard, I'll put that to you first, and then I'll come to you, Trevor, if I may.
Well, I think one of the problems I suspect behind it, at least as far as the Anglicans are concerned, is the Church of England. It is the national church, albeit we're not a theocracy. I think it's just a matter of getting the message out. And a lot of people who aren't churchgoers are enthusiastic supporters of church buildings and also the services that are carried out in them. And that it's got to be locked into, the arguments have got to be locked into that as well.
Really interesting. Thank you, Richard. Trevor, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, it's free at the point of use, isn't it? You can have your baby baptized, you can be buried in your churchyard. The sense of the old-fashioned utility, like a water utility, you just turn the tap on without paying for it. That's lingered. I don't know how we change that. In my particular church, our notice very politely says we receive no central funding. And I did wonder about having millions of leaflets printed, which people could put in their buildings saying that. But it's a long haul.
Interestingly, in Germany, there is a church tax, and you either pay a tax to the Lutherans, I understand, or to the Roman Catholics, or you don't. But if you don't, you're not allowed to have your children baptized nor be buried in the relevant churches. So intriguing approach from that part of the world to this problem.
And in 1868 in this country, one possibility was considered of having a church tax when they stopped the local church tax, having a national one. We might have ended up in the same situation.
But it is interesting. I think that's a really good point, isn't it? You quite rightly say in Germany, and there's little argument about it, is there, when it comes to those taxes? It's accepted as very much a part of their life. And I think your point, Richard, about the fact that lots of people who don't go to church regularly or at all are still supporters of the heritage and the conservation of church buildings, aren't they? Is that something you think, you both think, needs to be reinforced by just, again, putting the message out there?
Certainly the message needs to be made clearly that if it's not paid for, it won't be there. The next question you come to is, how do you achieve the necessary revenues to do that? And then disagreement.
Yeah, indeed. Trevor, one for you. Paul has said...
Emma, can I just jump in that last one?
Of course, please do.
The church tax idea sounds wonderful, but in fact on the continent there is now growing concern that youngsters, generation something or other, X, would it be, I lose count with these, is less and less willing to pay for it. So it looks good, but in this country we have a rather different tradition, which may in the end be more resilient, of local concern.
Indeed. That's very interesting. Okay, that's very interesting. And of course, as you quite rightly say, everything is these kind of things are often quite specific as well to culture, aren't they, and to heritage. That's very interesting. Thank you, Trevor. Paul has asked, Trevor, for you, does the long view use of church buildings imply that the grip of the conservation lobby should be relaxed? He's asked.
I'm not going to answer that as such. I don't think it'd be fair to answer.
Okay.
But I will make a comment, which is in the last 20 years I've seen a huge change in that the many of those involved in conservation understand that the buildings have to be used, and if they're not used, then they close, obviously, and that has affected a lot of thinking in this area.
Okay, thank you. Janet has asked, she says, I've heard it said that there are as many Roman Catholics worshipping at the weekend as Anglicans, but in 1/10 the number of buildings. Is this true? Now, you actually, you touched on that, didn't you, Trevor? Could you just pick up on that?
About 1/5 number of buildings, roughly speaking. Roughly.
Which is such a fascinating, it's fascinating the difference there, isn't it? With that. One that I wanted to kind of just touch on a little bit more, if I may. There is, I thought it was very interesting, your final slide, Trevor, looking at the different uses of the churches, and there is more and more emphasis, isn't there, on opening churches up to the wider community. How crucial do you both feel that is for the future? And I will ask, Trevor, if I can ask you first, and then take that to you, Richard.
Some people will know that I'm both enthusiastic and a cynic. I'm very enthusiastic indeed about the opening up in order to enlarge the stakeholder group, enlarge the number of people who have an interest in and feel the building in some way or another belongs to them. This is hugely important, and it ties very tightly into our cultural background of local interest, local concern. But this has somehow got transmogrified into an absurd suggestion that this itself is going to provide enough funding for these buildings, and it ain't.
Okay, that's very useful to have your reflection. Thank you, Trevor. Richard, the same point to you, please. If we could hear your thoughts on that.
I think the conclusion that Trevor's drawn is right. I think, yes, it's important that we do draw people in different ways, in different places, along the line of the diagram that Trevor showed us. Interesting, I think you go back to the end of the Middle Ages, for example, there was a lot more of that going on than there is now. So it's not as if it's a historic aberration. But I think the crucial thing is that if you're doing that, and it's true retrofitting a lot of buildings, you've got to respect the integrity of the building itself. And in fact, the question that you put to Trevor about the grip of conservationists is that you don't want to do a lot of unchangeable changes in doing this, as long as you preserve the inherent, my view, the inherent integrity of the structure. It may mean that the new uses have to slightly compromise from what is the best option for them. But if you can find a way of approaching it like that, I think there is a lot of benefit to be had. And I don't think it should be seen that conservation and retrofitting and new uses are incompatible with each other. Rather, they are part of an ongoing, evolving, living process.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you very much indeed. Rebecca has asked, how confident are either of you that a big enough pot of money will be forthcoming from the government to repair church buildings? And she's made the point that the lottery is the only grant large enough for big capital projects, yet it is inappropriate for building repair projects. Richard, can I put that to you first? I mean, how confident are you that there is enough?
I'm never confident about the government in this context. As the psalmist, I think it is, says, "Don't put not your trust in princes." It is important. The problem, I think, with a lot of the lottery, this is very much heresy, is by the time you've satisfied all their specifications, you end up spending so much more money, it sometimes isn't worth going there at all. We've got to find a way of using this money efficiently, as well as making sure that public money isn't wasted. And we mustn't also be too politically correct in this. If the object exercise is to do something to preserve the church, that's the focus of what the money's for, not a lot of other parallel, no doubt very worthy social aspirations.
Thank you, Trevor. Same question to you.
I don't think I can add anything to that. A lot of people are talking to the government and trying to persuade them, but these are strange and difficult times we live in.
Thank you. And Trevor, you spoke about the changing attitudes, which again was very interesting. How key is that for the survival of our churches and our church buildings?
I think I've lost you, Emma. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes. Can you hear me, Trevor?
Yes, could you just repeat the question?
Yes, of course, indeed. You spoke about changing attitudes, which was very interesting. How important do you think that is for the survival of our churches and church buildings?
It's fundamental. The National Churches Trust have done research on this, and Eddie reminded us in his Q&A that some years ago they found 57% of people wanted the government to support these buildings. Interestingly, we don't track this very well, and it may be that we need to do more work on what people actually want. To give one example, we've sort of assumed that when a church closes that people want it to be turned into a sort of village hall. And yet there's emerging evidence, I think, that people actually would often, not always, but often prefer it to be left as a quiet space, a special space, a place for concerts, exhibitions, particular things to happen in. As far as I know, no one's looked at that carefully. And maybe we need to do more work on what actually do the public think about all this.
Okay, thank you very much, gentlemen. It was absolutely fascinating to hear both of your thoughts. Lord Inglewood, Trevor Cooper, thank you very much indeed for your time today. It's hugely appreciated. I hope we got to most of your questions there. There's a couple more we haven't managed to get to. We will try and answer those in the Q&A section there, so we will get to those hopefully in that Q&A there. We'll type those in. Fascinating to hear your thoughts, gentlemen. Thank you very much indeed. We are going to take a short break now, but plenty more still to come. We'll see you in just a few minutes at 10:30.
Church buildings are a constant feature of Cumbria's landscape, often displaying an array of local and national craftsmanship, making them some of the most architecturally and culturally significant buildings in our county. It's no secret that the care, conservation, maintenance and repair of church buildings is considerable, and these specially commissioned videos have been produced in order to better understand these buildings, improve their maintenance, and develop a long-term strategy for their sustainability by encouraging and improving their management and exploring their potential wider uses as heritage and community assets.
We have a tremendous legacy of churches we would like to see as well maintained as possible, and helping to secure their futures by having links with their community, and that these films, we're sure, will make a positive impact towards that, and that the legacy will be healthier, better, brighter, well-maintained churches for Cumbria going forward.
Our church buildings are some of the most culturally and historically significant buildings in our county. Regular maintenance and repair is essential to conserve these buildings for the future. And we also need our buildings to be adaptable to change if needed. Archaeology expert Humphrey Welfare helps us discover how better understanding the history, construction and fabric of our church buildings is essential. He explains what to look for and how it can help inform our decisions to produce positive changes and better outcomes.
It's really about asking questions and being curious. What's that? How did that get there? How does this bit relate to that bit? That understanding is absolutely crucial, not just to big projects, but actually to daily care.
Visit our website to find out how to access the full series of videos. Our church buildings are some of the most culturally and historically significant buildings in our county. Regular maintenance and repair is essential to conserve these buildings for the future. And we also need our buildings to be adaptable to change if needed. But how do we go about making changes to our buildings? What are the rules and regulations? And where can we go for help and advice?
Well, we find it helpful to be involved as soon as possible. So rather than starting with a formal application, we will often be drawn into what we refer to as a preliminary inquiry.
The critical document is the quinquennial inspection report, and that's the starting document really for a lot of this work.
My key piece of advice would be to consult as early as possible in the process, both with the local authorities and, if the building's grade 1 or grade 2, start with Historic England.
Visit our website to find out how to access the full series of videos.
Welcome back. Now, if you managed to watch some of those videos playing in the break, we hope that you found them interesting and enjoyable. They were produced as part of the Caring for Cumbria's Churches project. And that brings me neatly onto our next guest, Jayne Potts. Good morning, Jayne. Jayne is the Development Officer for the Churches Trust for Cumbria and coordinator of today's event. And Jayne is going to tell us more about those videos and the Caring for Cumbria's Churches project overall. And if anyone has any questions for Jayne, please do pop them into the Q&A now or over the next few minutes, and we will pick those up at the end of this session. Jayne, good morning. First of all, tell us, how did this project come about in the first place? Tell us a bit more about it.
Morning, Emma. I don't think it's any secret to say that the caring for our church buildings can be a real challenge. That's both locally and nationally. Just to recap some of the things that Trevor said, in essence, congregations are getting smaller and generally older. We have a legacy of buildings, many of which are listed, being supported by a small number of volunteers relying on decreasing funds. And as Trevor said earlier, the situation is not something new, but I wonder if it has perhaps been accelerated a little bit by COVID. So we sat down prior to COVID as well and thought, what can we do to make these buildings more resilient? And the project aimed to produce a series of tools to support those who care for church buildings. And we were lucky enough to receive funding from the National Lottery Heritage Fund.
So what are the tools, and why do you think they're needed?
Emma, in my role, I visit many churches, both as the Churches Trust for Cumbria Development Officer and as a DAC member. And one of the most important things that we can do to sustain these buildings is good maintenance. So the first tool is a self-assessment template for maintenance. Basically, it's there to encourage regular checks of the building and to carry out repairs when needed. It's quite simple. It's based on a checklist. It covers external and internal features of a church building, services such as the heating, as well as the churchyard and many more things. Indeed, you can edit the details to suit your church. So you can add specific features of your church, Or if you don't have a tower, you can delete that, as I'm sure there's lots of people in Cumbria at the moment who'd like to do that with their towers. It's certainly not the only maintenance template out there. And to be honest, I don't mind which one is used, as long as regular checks and routine maintenance are carried out. You know, clean the drains, empty the gutters, blah, blah, blah. I'm sure you've all heard this before, but I cannot stress enough the importance of good maintenance for our church buildings. The second tool is a series of videos, some of which you've seen this morning. Cumbria is a large county, and we wanted to find a way to get information to people in an interesting way, and also maybe introduce church buildings to a wider audience. So there are 7 short trailer-style videos to introduce the subjects, and then each one of these has a longer, more in-depth version. The videos cover several topics about understanding your church building, how they are built, who can help you if you want to make changes, how to share your church's story, and one on the conservation of stained glass. To be honest, we could have made lots more videos, but it was really difficult to cover the many aspects that caring for these buildings takes. However, I must say a big thanks to Brilliant Trees Media for making them, and to everybody who volunteered their time to appear in them and to make them as well. And I think, or I hope, what comes across in the videos is that people really do care about these buildings, and that there are professionals out there who can help you. The third tool is the Sustainability Rosette. The Rosette came out of Cumbria's Ecumenical Church Buildings Audit, which was done in 2012-13, one of the first of its kind. The Rosette was created to help church communities assess the ingredients for a viable church building. And rather than reinvent the wheel, we decided to reintroduce it. And during a series of project workshops across Cumbria, the Rosette was reviewed, and following feedback, it was revised and updated. For example, it now only has 10 petals and includes a petal on energy efficiency. We've also made a video explaining the Rosette and each of the petals, but the idea is that by carefully considering each petal, you will be able to identify areas of need and create an action plan for a viable church building. Churches will also be asked to consider how their decisions may affect other churches in the neighbouring area or mission community, as we have in Cumbria. And in Cumbria, that for us, that also means working together ecumenically, sharing ideas and planning things together. For example, in Kirkby Lonsdale, the Methodists and the Church of England share resources and one big vision. For others, it may be sharing one building. The Rosette looks easy and sounds easy, but actually it means asking some quite difficult questions and providing some very honest answers about the viability of your church building.
Yeah, indeed. It is wonderful to hear more about the project and some great tools there. So what are the next steps in this project then, Jayne?
We are about to start some pilot schemes. We have invited 4 groups, each with 3 or 4 churches in them, to try out and use the Sustainability Rosette. First, to assess their own church building, think about its long-term future and what that looks like. And each group of churches will share their individual results before discussing all of the buildings within the cluster. And the purpose of that is to gain a sort of realistic and practical overview of the long-term resilience of each building, with the overall aim of trying to develop a local building strategy. And within that, we want to look at lots of options, and options for churches will include the idea of hibernating churches. This is like being a festival church or a fallow church, depending where you come from in the country, but where churches are not used for regular services, but maybe several times a year, but rather than completely closing. And in some places, I think this is already happening. I know it is in Cumbria, and particularly after COVID, churches are changing their user patterns. But if things change again, then the church can come out of hibernation. However, a hibernating church still needs to be insured, maintained, and have quinquennial inspections. We are working with Ecclesiastical Insurance to use the maintenance template as evidence of regular maintenance plan, so that the building still remains, the insurance still remains valid. And hibernating a church or closing a church is not an easy option. Ideally, we do want to use our church buildings and we want them to be used by the whole community. But I think we have to be a little bit realistic. And for me, beginning to have these conversations at the grassroots level and looking at all the options is the first step to understanding the future role of these buildings.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you, Jayne. And if anyone wants further information on this, where can they go for it? Where can they find that?
They can have a look on the website under the Caring for Cumbria's Churches. There's a section there. All of the tools are on there. Or you can email me and I'll happily try and answer any questions.
Fantastic, Jayne, thank you so much. Right, we're going to take some questions for Jayne now from the floor. So please do head to the Q&A function. I'd be very grateful if you could put to Jayne at the start of your question, just so it flags up to me exactly that this is for this this section. John West has just put a reflection, Jayne. I'm sure you understand. Kendal Parish Church certainly having trouble with their tower there. I can see, you know, that's something that will resonate, isn't it? Your comment there about the tower. Can I just, my question really, first of all, is how interesting that there's so much demand for this project. Just the fact that we've got people from all over the country here today shows how strong that demand is, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think that COVID, particularly after COVID, the way we use our church buildings has changed immensely. We haven't been able to use them for quite a number of months. And I think as Trevor said earlier, and Richard, some of the signs were there that things were changing. And I think COVID has accelerated that. And I think people are now looking for solutions and for answers and how to take things forward and what they can do with their church building and what the options are. So yeah, I think we're on the cusp of quite a big shift and change. And I would hope that you know, attitudes do change, and that the best thing for a building is that it is used. I mean, that is the best. Buildings were there to be used, and for used for what they were built for. That would be great.
Yeah, indeed. It sounds an obvious question, this one, but why is it? Can you spell out to us, why is it so important to really get a grip of that maintenance? Why is maintenance so key?
Buildings decay. You know, almost the moment you build something, decay starts. When you think that lots of our buildings, you know, they maybe have medieval or were first built there, or even in Victorian times, but that, you know, that's 150 years ago. So maintenance is the most practical and economical way to conserve our buildings. And if we can keep making checks on it and making sure that it is okay, then that is the best way forward.
Thank you. We've had a message from a question from Clive. I don't know if you can answer this or not, Jayne. If not, Clive, we will get the answer to you a little later on. In Cumbria, do you know how many festival churches there are now? And is there an area where they are established and well received? Are you able to give a bit of detail on that, Jayne?
Clive, if you can tell me, that would be great. That's one of the things that I'd be looking at and looking to see how people are using their church buildings now and how they feel about that. And as I say, I think there have been shifts after COVID. It's not something that I can answer right now. I know in other parts, sorry, Emma, I know in other parts of the country, they are looking at this as an option as well. I know that one of my trustees said, you know, we don't want to have a beaching with our churches. We don't want to close them all and then realize 50 years down the line that we made a mistake and we've lost these buildings. So I think for me, it's all about looking at the different options, and that might be looking at individual options for each church.
Okay, thank you. Verity is asking, does using churches less rather than more not make it harder to maintain them rather than easier? What's your views on that, Jayne?
Yeah, absolutely. the less you use a building, the less that you're looking at it, the less that you see things. I mean, lots of maintenance is actually just about looking at the building to spot the signs. So yes, she's absolutely right. That's why we need to find ways to use the buildings more.
Yeah, thank you. Interesting point, question from Sue. How do we handle the long-term sustainability when in many churches reserves and all income streams are already being run down significantly just to keep the buildings maintained, and thus potentially neglecting the wider mission? What's your, have you got some points on that to make, Jayne?
I think it's really difficult. It's not the first time. I mean, we've been having this argument almost for 2,000 years about mission and the building. I can't answer that. I don't think anyone can maybe answer that, but I think it's important that we look at each building individually and that decisions are made on how you feel about that for that particular church building. And that's certainly what I would hope that we can do in Cumbria.
Thank you. Clive has come back to say he thinks there might be some examples. I think this is on the hibernating churches in the Southern Lakes, but none local to him in Appleby. Thank you, Clive, for that. And just going through a few more of your questions. I mean, there's another one here. In terms of the rosette, Jayne, where do you see the challenges for churches when using that rosette?
I think being honest is going to be one of the hardest challenges, actually. I think sitting down and looking at your building and trying to answer a series of questions about it, or think about each of the petals, and being realistic and honest, I think that's going to be quite difficult for some people. And I think some churches will find they're very strong in some areas and they might be weaker in other areas, and that's where it can be used to try and improve the areas and help in those areas. I don't know, come back to me in a few months when we've done some pilots, and we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, we're almost out of time, but just to, on the rosettes, while we're on this, Stuart's made the reflection. He says the problem with the rosette is that it has too often been perceived as competition in a mission community to present a case to keep your own. We are almost out of time, Jayne, but maybe you could just briefly give your thoughts on that point.
I think that's, yeah, I think that it could be perceived that way. For me, it's there to try and help the PCC or trying to help the church, and it's not a competition in my book, but yes, I can certainly see that people might look at it from that point of view, but it's certainly not my intention, and it's not the intention of the trust to make it like that.
Yeah, okay, great. Jayne, it is a wonderful project and you've done fantastic work on it. Thank you so much for your time talking that through. And as Jayne said, if you do want to find out more about the Caring for Cumbria's Churches project and those tools that we were talking about that are available, just visit the CTFC website. All those details are coming up in the post-conference email. Thank you, Jayne. Right, our next speaker, Marion Barter, is a historic buildings advisor. Now, Marion specialises in providing written reports and advice about historic buildings and places, particularly to explain why a building might be significant from a heritage perspective and to identify options for change. Now, Marion was brought up in Cumbria and still has strong links to the county, and she's very kindly agreed to join us today to talk about the importance of statements of significance. And I'm sure many of you will be very familiar with the concept of a statement of significance. Some of you perhaps less so. Don't worry, Marion will be explaining all. Now, before I hand over, just to say that we will be opening up to questions after this, so please do get those into the Q&A there at the bottom of your screen, and Marion will be dealing with those a little later on. But Marion, good morning, over to you.
Thanks very much, Emma. Great to be here, and it's fantastic that there are so many people participating in this event, and a really interesting debate that's going on. So here my slides, they're just coming up now. Thanks very much to Rob for sorting out the tech. So this morning I'm going to, next slide please. I'm going to talk a little bit about what a statement of significance is and how to go about compiling one, and then a bit about how they're useful. For those of you who don't know, we'll go through all the different stages, and I'll try to say a little bit about whether it's something that you can do yourself or the church architect, or do it collaboratively, and at what point perhaps you should bring in a professional to help you. We're going to talk a bit about how you go about doing some research, what kinds of resources that you can use online or using existing books and so on, a bit about reading the building, actually looking at the building as evidence of its history. We're going to particularly have a little look at pews and other fittings, because they're most often affected by either reordering for worship or to introduce more flexibility to bring in the other uses that we've been talking about already. A little bit about how you assess the level of significance, how to get a handle on, are the things within the church very important to the significance of the building overall, or might there be some scope to change things? And then finally, what are they used for? Next slide, please. So I had a good look online to see what definitions there are, because I thought it'd be useful just to come up with a couple of sentences. And this is on the Church of England website from the guidance on statements of significance and needs. And this quite succinctly tells us that a statement of significance describes how the building has changed over time, inside and out. It sums up why some items are important and what they contribute to the character of the building. So that, in essence, is what one is. So the next slide, I'm going to have another look at the Church of England guidance. So this is the statutory guidance note that the Church of England produces to help parishes produce statements of significance. And the reason it's statutory is that for your faculty application, you have to produce a statement of significance and a statement of need. So this is the equivalent of government policy guidance for secular buildings. And it's a really useful website. There's lots of resources on the Church Care site, and I'd recommend that you have a look at it if you've not used it before. And it provides a template. If you've got a very simple change that's being proposed in the church, for example, perhaps just a bit of new lighting or a single new fitting, you don't necessarily need to produce a statement of significance from scratch, and you could probably just use the template that's on the Church Care in the Church Care guidance notes, and you can download it as a Word document and fill it out yourself. You might need some help from the architect. For longer statements, and these would be required if you're proposing quite a complex project where there's some major reordering and perhaps you're making changes to improve facilities and so on to help with other community uses. You may well need to write a new statement of significance if there isn't one already for the church. And the Church Care guidance goes through what this should cover, so that you need to kind of use the guidance as a checklist to make sure that you've addressed all the subheadings. So it includes describing the history of the building, its phases of construction and restoration, describe the building itself. So start with the exterior and the plan, that's the arrangement of the spaces and the different elements of the building. Then the interior, then the fittings, and then also describe the burial ground and the setting. And often the setting may be more than just the burial ground, it might cover part of the village or town centre. And then finally, well, perhaps not quite finally, but using all this information that you've gathered, have a go at measuring the cultural value and the interest of the church. And this is how you articulate why its significance. why it is significant. And the Church of England guidance provides you with 4 separate subheadings under which to consider the importance of the church. It's history, architecture, archaeology and art. And then you can think about, under each of those headings, is it high, moderate or low significance, the building as a whole, and also the separate parts of the building. And then once you've got a scheme that's been chosen, and perhaps you've had some early discussions with the DAC, you can add a section onto the statement of significance on what the impact of the proposals will be. Next slide, please. So here is an example content. So I've got 8 separate sections here, and there's an additional one that I use, which may not always be relevant, but I think it's quite helpful, and that's item 7. And that's to just write a few paragraphs on what the cultural context for the church is. And I partly, if I'm writing a statement of significance, I partly do that for the parish, just to give people a bit more of an idea of why the building's significant, say, for its architecture. And if it's a building that's like the one in the picture, which is actually a redundant church that's on the Historic England at Risk register, this is a Gothic Revival church. So it's quite useful just to write a couple of paragraphs. What is the Gothic Revival? Where did it come from? Which architects particularly excelled at this building style? And why might your church be a good example of this kind of architectural style? But if you've got a medieval church, you might be useful to have a paragraph or 2 on the medieval church, its main elements and how it was changed at the Reformation and what survives of that pre-Reformation interior. Next slide, please. So this is the fun bit. Find out about the history of the building. And I'm just going to, the next few slides, I'm going to go through some of the different places that you can go to get information on your church. So start off with what you've already got. You may already have a draft statement of significance that somebody's had a go at writing. You might already have a good church guidebook. And some of the other published sources, which are also referred to as secondary sources, I'll go through those as well. And it's important when you're writing, if you make a statement about the restoration took place in, say, 1877, to just say where you got that information from. It's useful for people reading the report to know that that you've checked your facts, and that you say where you've got the information from. And if you're using primary records such as plans, which you might get out of the archives, you just need to interpret them with a bit of caution, because not every plan was actually built as it was drawn. And finally, it's really important to consult with local people. It's important to do that because people who live in the village or the town may have information about the building which hasn't been published and isn't in any accessible archive. And also it means that the statement of significance isn't just written by one person. I think it's good if it can be a bit of a collaborative effort so that other people involved in the church feel part of this process. Next slide, please. So a few books which have been which are useful to refer to. I'd always have a look at the Pevsner, and in the top right hand corner of the screen you can see the Pevsner for Lancashire and South East Manchester. The architecture of Sharp Paley and Austin. Many churches in Cumbria and North Lancashire were designed or restored by this architectural practice, and this book is a fantastic place to go. You can look at your building and there'll be some information in there. And also local history books. This is the bottom right hand picture is a book written by one of the past vicars of Kendal Parish Church, which is packed full of information. Next slide, please. primary sources. So a primary source might be a plan or a map or a photograph, or it might be the church warden's accounts, which are in the local archive. So it's a document that was produced and hasn't necessarily been published or interpreted. So on the screen you can see 3 images, and these are all of the Church of St Martin in Bowness, where I wrote a statement of significance for a few years ago, and all these images were in a cupboard in the vestry. So it's just another reminder, you may already have some fantastic information in the church. If it's not in the church, it might have landed up in the archives. Next slide, please. Works of art in the church. There might be drawings or engravings, stained glass windows may depict the church. A couple of examples on the screen here for Cartmel and Kendal Parish Church. Next slide, please. Online research, there's now masses of information available online. Lots of archive material is gradually being digitised. And there's just 2 examples that I've put up here. The church plans that are in the Lambeth Palace collection are part of the collection from the Incorporated Church Building Society, which is an organisation that funded the restoration or building of new churches because they were keen for pews to be freely available. And you can search online for free, and on the screen you won't be able to read these, but some of these are churches in Cumbria. Newspaper archives are a fantastic source. Sometimes you can see these in your local library, but they're online as well. And there's a surprising amount of detail, including the example that I've used from 1853, the Westmoreland Gazette. This is a report on a new window designed by Warrington of London for the Gandy family. Next slide, please. I think we just need to go to the one, but that's it, thank you. If you need to go to the county archive, you can look at the online catalogue before you go to see whether they might have any material that's relevant to your church. You can also contact the archivist to ask what you'll be able to look at and to arrange the visit. Because of COVID, archives are closed at the moment, but you can still contact the archivist and they can be incredibly helpful. These are 2 drawings related to Sedbergh Parish Church. Next slide, please. Now, I've just got a couple of slides on looking at the building before we break for a video, because I think I'm just about on time. So we've done some research on the building, and you've gathered as much as you can on archives and from books and so on. So the next really important thing is to actually look at the building. Look for evidence of alteration and its phases of construction, and you can see this in the masonry. Using historic plan, walk around the building and work out how much it changed during the 19th or the 20th century. Have fittings been moved around? Have they been taken out altogether? And look for clues such as dated features like rainwater hoppers or plaques recording gifts of new fittings. Next slide, please. So I've just put up on the screen a few examples of the kinds of features which help you interpret the building and its history. So on the left, we've got a window at Kendal Parish Church in an area of wall that would have been covered with rough cast render. And above the Victorian window, you can just see the ghost of an earlier window that was blocked up during the Victorian restoration. There's a rainwater hopper dated 1866, that's at Kirby Lonsdale Church. And the vestry, built in 1915, was added on to Grange Methodist Church. There isn't a date on the vestry, but we knew how old it was because we found the drawings. And finally, as an example of a plaque, and all churches will have numerous plaques which record or their memorials to vicars or notable people in the parish, and sometimes they refer to restorations. In this case at Workington, Sir Ninian Comper, the architect, advised in the 1930s. So I think the next slide, this is my cue to introduce the video. We've made a video for you to have a look at. It was made with the help of Dave Roberts from the Diocese of Carlisle, and myself and a volunteer from Kendal Parish Church had a walk around the church, and we just looked at a couple of features and discussed how you go about thinking about the significance of the features and how they're part of the church as a whole. It's about 10 minutes and then I'll be back.
Hello, we're in Kendal Parish Church today, and we're going to talk about the church and why it's significant. As lots of people probably know, Kendal Parish Church is the oldest and the most significant historic building that's still in use in Kendal, and it's a Grade 1 listed building, and it's looked after by the PCC. And I'm joined by John West, who's a volunteer at Kendal Parish Church, and we're going to look at some of the features on the outside of the building, and then we're going to go inside and have a look at some of the fittings. Hi John, nice to see you, thanks for coming today. We're just going to have a look at the tower and you know, a bit about why it looks the way it does.
Perhaps you can tell us something about the significance of the tower and its stonework.
Well, it's probably a 15th century tower, and at some point it was raised by a stage, maybe in the 17th century. But what's interesting about it in terms of its appearance is that it wouldn't have looked like this before about 1850. Until about 1850, the whole church was covered with rough cast render, which would have protected it from the weather. And as you know, they would have maintained that by slapping lime wash on it and patching it up. And then in 1850, the church, with Trinity College, Cambridge, which partly paid for the repairs, they decided to do a big restoration, and they got a Manchester architect in called Joseph Crowther, and one of the first things they did was to strip all the rough cast render off the church. So since then it's not been rendered, and we've got bare stonework which has to be pointed. And so that's caused some problems, hasn't it, as you know?
It has, yes.
Yeah, because the cement, they've used cement in the pointing, and that stops the stonework drying out.
Yes. I think the history is that the water's been coming in for quite a long time, because if we go inside we can see that in the past people have put lead gutters round the pillars inside to catch the water as it runs down the inside of the pillars. And then when we had Storm Desmond in 2015, we had a real deluge, and the water came in everywhere and drowned the organ. And since then we've had to put up a plastic sheeting over the organ to catch the water, and a gutter system and with buckets that catch the water, and then when it rains heavily we have to come in regularly to empty the buckets.
So it really does need sorting out, doesn't it?
It really does need something serious doing to it, yes.
All over Cumbria there's now a kind of shift in thinking that actually it might be quite a good idea to put rough cast back on a few of these wet church towers. So the present appearance isn't significant really, apart from it tells a story of part of the Victorian attitude towards restoration. So in itself, this exposed stonework isn't architecturally or historically significant, so you could change that.
When we come round to the corner to the porch, of course, we see that it's a completely different type of stonework to the tower. And maybe Marion, you can tell us something about the significance of that.
Okay, well, it's all part of the history of this huge restoration in the 1850s, where the Manchester architect Joseph Crowther worked on the church, and he designed this new porch. And instead of it being faced in rubble stone with a rough cast render, it's been deliberately designed with ashlar, so it didn't need rough cast render. So again, it was part of this Victorian trend of turning their backs on traditional finishes like rough cast render, and this kind of ashlar dress stone finish was used. So it has much tighter joints, and the stone's got a good face on it, so they didn't need to render it. So it looks completely different from this much older masonry on this 15th century part of the church.
Marion, that's very interesting. So shall we go and have a look inside now then?
Yeah, okay, let's have another look.
And here we are, we're inside this magnificent building of Kendal Parish Church now. One of the widest churches in England, 100 feet wide, and it's got 5 aisles, which is very unusual. Of course, Kendal was a prosperous wool town in the Middle Ages, and that's why the church had to keep being expanded, and instead of expanding lengthways, they expanded sideways.
Yeah, so we've got this huge rectangular building rather than a kind of linear church. It's like an enormous rectangle,
Yes,
isn't it?
yeah.
The core of the building's 13th century, and that's why we've got these cylindrical columns here and the pointed arches, and then the outer aisles are 15th century. As you say, that's related to the prosperity that the town got from wool. And then by the 18th century, the church was full of box pews, and they had the pulpit sort of up here somewhere. And we've seen that because in the book that you showed me by a previous vicar, Reverend Hodgkinson, there are photographs, and we can see that there were box pews and this pulpit and lots of screens around all the side chapels.
So Marion, we've had this massive Victorian restoration of the church, but how do we know what the church looked like before that time, before the days of photography?
Well, it's a good question, because this restoration was in about 1850, so photography hadn't got going at that stage. Well, it was very, very early days. But there are some drawings of the interior, and there are also descriptions that there are accounts of what the building was like. And if you go to Kendal Archives, they've got all the minutes from the parish meetings where they were discussing the state of the building and what it was like. And also in Kendal Archives, they've got a plan, which I have here, of what the building was like after the restoration. And you can see, looking at this plan, that it was completely full of pews.
Right.
And all the box pews had been swept away. And as part of the restoration, the chancel was completely reordered, and the pulpit that's there now, it's shown on this plan, and that dates from about 1852. And they had a Victorian chancel with choir stalls facing each other across the chancel. And this is all significant because it's part of that shift in Victorian attitudes to liturgy. And they wanted to revive a pre-restoration layout for the chancel. They thought that was the important way to lay out a chancel, with the high altar being the focus of services, and they wanted the pulpit to be at the chancel arch. That was a very strong Victorian fashion, really, and so that's why we've got all these pews and the pulpit there. But when we go and talk about the chancel, of course, there isn't anything Victorian left in it, is there?
No, that was all swept away in the 60s when they had yet another reorganisation.
Exactly, which reflected attitudes to worship and liturgy in the post-war period. So all of these different phases, they're all part of the historic significance of the building.
Right. We've moved down and we're next to the chancel, and looking at the chancel I can see that the Victorian restoration seems to have completely disappeared. There doesn't seem to be anything Victorian left in this area. Perhaps you can tell us something about the significance of that.
Well, that's a very good question, John, because we know what the Victorian chancel looked like because we've seen it on this plan.
Right.
And also there are lots of photographs from the late Victorian and early 20th century which show the chancel with its Victorian fittings. And then in the 1960s, there was a decision to reorder and bring the altar forward. The altar, there still is a high altar at the East End, but they decided that they wanted to have their main altar here. So that's why we've got this big stone platform, and they removed all the Victorian fittings. I think it happened gradually, not in one go, but as you rightly said, there's nothing Victorian in this part of the chancel except for the pulpit. So we've got the pulpit designed by Joseph Crowther, the architect, and it was installed in about 1852, similar date to the porch actually, but it's a fragment of the Victorian reordering. So it's interesting that to talk about what is the significance of that pulpit. It's the only thing that's left from that Victorian reordering, but it's a bit isolated. And I would, you know, we could have a conversation about, well, what's significant about this area now? It's got very little architectural or historic significance because it's lost all the Victorian fittings. So will that help you when you and others in the PCC are discussing what to do next?
So yes, because we are having discussions about a reordering in order to make the building now more suitable for its current uses, and of course we have to consider all the significance of all the equipment that's in here at the moment.
Yeah, well, good luck with all those deliberations, and thanks very much for coming down to talk together about the parish church.
Hello again. I hope you found that useful, and I hope you spotted my mistake that I referred to the Victorians creating a pre-restoration chancel. Of course, what they were trying to do was look back to a pre-Reformation layout. So I thought it would be useful to talk a little bit about pews and other fittings, because if you're thinking about either reordering your church to change the layout for worship, or thinking about making the building more open and flexible for a range of other uses, it's often the pews that people are most keen to remove. And there's lots of advice available on this. You can have a look on the Church Care website, and it's also, if you can, get hold of this book edited by Trevor Cooper, who of course you've already heard from this morning, and Sarah Brown, and there's a wealth of information in here about the history of seating in churches, and also some tips on how to weigh up whether you really do need to remove the historic seating, and how to consider whether it's significant. So before you embark on a programme to sweep away what you've got, it's really important to first understand how significant the pews and the seating are in the church. And the more important, the older seating is, the more important it tends to be, although I have to say that some schemes of Victorian seating are very important, but I'll come on to that in a moment. So if there is still any pre-Reformation, that's medieval seating left in the church, that's very rare and it's going to be of high significance, so you would be expected to keep it. The same really goes for 17th century or Georgian seating. It's also fairly rare, and that's because the Victorians were so thorough in reseating naves, particularly as part of reordering schemes. The important thing to think about is how much does seating contribute to the character of the church interior and the significance of the building as a whole. Where seating entirely fills the nave, then it does tend to dominate the atmosphere and people's first impressions. But it's also important to think about what is the quality of the seating, and you can analyse this by finding out a bit more about it. Was it part of a particular restoration? Do you know who designed it? Is it by one of the important Victorian architects? If seating is going to be by somebody like Butterfield or Street or Scott or by Paley and Austin, if you're in Cumbria, then it has been well designed by an architect that was well regarded. But it might have been moved around or altered. The other thing that you can do is compare the fittings within your church with fittings by similar architects in other nearby churches. So you can start to get a feel for, are yours at the high end of quality, or perhaps they're more in the middle ground. Next slide, please. So a little bit more on trying to think about how significant are the pews. I was asked to look at the seating in this parish church, Grassingham in Lancashire, which is a fabulous, quite early medieval building that's got some Romanesque Norman features. And at first glance, it appeared to have seating that was possibly Georgian, because the pews in the central nave all have doors, as does the seating in the aisles. But when I had a look at this in detail, it was apparent that the seating in the aisles, which is they are Georgian box pews, but the joinery has been moved about and reassembled, and the seating in the nave was part of a restoration by the architects Paley and Austin. And looking at newspaper archives, I was able to find an account in a newspaper which clearly described that the old pews were moved to the aisles, and that new seating was provided in the nave in 1862. It's quite interesting because they were quite conservative, and they obviously tried to emulate the style of the earlier pews. So we've got good understanding of what happened in this church in the 1860s, and that can start to inform a discussion about how important they are. And you know, you might take a different view on this, but you might be able to say that perhaps the 1860s pews aren't quite as significant as the Georgian ones. But then you've got to think about the impact on the building as a whole. So it's important to kind of balance your thinking. Next slide, please. Other fittings. So of course there will be a font, there will be a pulpit, there may be important memorials within the church. And all of these things need to be individually considered. So when I'm writing a statement of significance, I make sure that I understand each individual piece, what date it is it associated with any notable figures, either designers or donors? Has it been moved around? And you'd refer to old photographs or newspaper accounts and plans to find out how much fittings have moved. Quite often the font hasn't moved as much as you might think, but it might have a new cover, and it's quite common to find a Victorian or early 20th century cover provided on a medieval font. And that's the case with these photographs here, where we've got a medieval font in the left photo, and then a completely different church actually. The right-hand photograph is a font cover in the church in Workington, which is early 20th century, part of the restoration at that period. And then in the middle photograph, we've got a Georgian pulpit, which might have been moved around, and I think it's no longer on the plinth that it originally had, but it does still relate to some Georgian box pews, so there's an important relationship there. And again, as well as look at each piece individually, think about how does it contribute to the significance of the church. Is it part of a coherent reordering, or is it part of the kind of happy mishmash of pieces from different periods that give the building its particular charm? Next slide, please. So the other thing to think about, which I mentioned briefly early on, is the setting of the church. This may not be particularly relevant if you're only thinking of changes to the church interior, but if you're thinking about changes to the outside, perhaps to provide more parking or the best place for an extension for new facilities, you need to understand the setting and how that contributes to the significance of the building. Setting, the definition of this, that's the surroundings in which a heritage asset, i.e. the church, is experienced. So it may be more than just the burial ground or the churchyard. It might include adjoining public spaces or private areas, and you think about where is the church viewed from? Are there important views of the church from public footpaths or roads? Are parts of the setting perhaps negative? Have changes been made that spoil views of the church? Perhaps these could be enhanced in a future scheme. Next slide, please. So I've just got a couple of slides left now. So all of these different areas we've been looking at, we've looked at the history of the building, we've looked at the fabric, we've looked at the fittings, we've looked at the setting, and all of this we bring together to think about and articulate the significance of the building as a whole and its component parts. And on the Church Care website, there's a bit of guidance on what the different levels of significance mean. So you can rank your church from high to low significance, but most churches are going to be at the upper level. Churches make up a large proportion of all the Grade 1 listed buildings in the country. So your church is at least nationally important. Grade 2 listed buildings, the church is still important. It's still being listed by Historic England on behalf of the government, but it may not be as significant as a Grade 1 or a Grade 2 star building, so it's moderate to high. And then moderate significance level, that's a building of local value, so it's probably not listed. But it might be in a conservation area, or it might even be on a local list, and it will certainly be valued by local people, even if it's not officially designated. And so there aren't going to be very many churches which are in the low category, I think. But it's important, whatever level you decide upon, that you provide evidence to back your argument. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how statements of significance can be used, and this is just a photograph of Cartmel Priory, which some of you will recognise. It's a fabulous medieval building that was in monastic use and has then continuously been used as parish church. And to enable better use to be made of the building for a wider range of activities, some pews and a font designed by Paley and Austin have been moved from the West End to create a larger space, and the faculty for that will have been informed by an understanding of all the fittings before the decision was made. So it's crucial to have this understanding of significance before you can embark on making changes to make the building work for today. Next slide, please. So here are just a few examples of reasons why it's useful to have a statement of significance. And I think if you don't have one at all, it's worth thinking about how you're going to go about getting one, whether you're going to do it as a parish or do you need to get some professional help, because it's really useful to already have it, because there might suddenly be some funding available for which you need to be able to demonstrate why your building's significant. So it's a useful thing to be thinking about before you embark on a project. So it provides everybody with a really good understanding of the church building and its contents and fittings, and it's important to have access to that understanding at the earliest point in discussing ideas for changes to the building. And it's invaluable for any discussions that you have with other bodies like the DAC or Historic England and the National Amenity Societies like the Georgian Group. And also local people will be interested, and it helps them understand the church too, even if they don't worship there. As I've already said, it's essential for faculty application, and if your development proposal needs planning, which isn't exempt from isn't exempt through the ecclesiastical exemption process. For example, an extension, you'd need a statement of significance for that as well. And it informs good conservation and management, and of course you can use it to support a bid for grant aid and funding, and also you can draw on the information that was found through the research for the statement of significance for perhaps a new guidebook or material on the church website, or for use in heritage tourism. And I just wanted to refer back to something that Richard Inglewood said, that we all want to see a future for churches, and I for one have become much more pragmatic about how they can be used, but it's just so important that we do respect the integrity of the building and its significance, and we will all need to compromise. So thanks very much. I hope that was useful.
That was so useful, Marion. Thank you so much. I know that, I'm sure everyone found that incredibly useful, with many hints and tips there. So thank you. We are going to open up now to questions for Marion for the next 10 minutes or so. So please do get them into the Q&A if you haven't already. First of all, I'm just going to deal with a couple of people who very kindly put some important points to make in. One, just to emphasize that other denominations have similar procedures and similar guidance on statements of significance and need. That's important point to make, isn't it, Marion?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, I know. I think Joanna is here from the Methodists, and they have a similar rigorous process and need statements of significance. And yeah, I know that the Catholic Church does too.
Thank you. And an important, just a tip from the National Churches Trust regarding the Incorporated Church Building Society. A book called Free Seats for All is available from the NCT, from the National Churches Trust. Please contact info@nationalchurchestrust.org if you would like a copy. So that's just a useful point to be made. We have had some very interesting questions, which I will go through now. One from Paul, which is an interesting one. Just jumped out of my thing. Here we go. What is the best way to resolve disputes about controversial proposed alterations? When, for example, the PCC wished to remove highly significant pews, what's your advice on that, Marion? Because sometimes there can be differing opinions on this, can't there?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. There will and there may be resistance from some people to pew removal, not just from experts in the conservation world, but also from local people. It is a very difficult thing, and it can be very emotive. So absolutely, I think the first thing to do is make sure that you really do understand the pews. When were they made? When were they put into that part of the church? Have they been moved around? So you need to understand the facts, and then you need to step back and think, how do these pews contribute to the interior of the church as a whole? And if you were to remove some of them, would the rest of them still contribute in a significant way? So sometimes there might be scope for removing a block of pews, but still keep some significant sections of pews. But it is a very difficult thing, and I think the only way you can do is to bring people together. People need to be able to have an opportunity to say what they think and discuss it openly. And it is all about compromise, as Richard Inglewood said. We've all got to let go a little bit in order for change to happen. So it can be quite a painful process.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And we've had another one as well from Paul. Is not significance really just in the eye of the beholder? How do you ensure that objective assessments are made, Marion?
A very good question. Well, I think you've obviously got to show that you've worked through the steps in a rigorous way and that you haven't jumped to conclusions. You've got to show that you're taking a fairly impartial, independent view, and that you've got to avoid being at all sentimental. You know, I absolutely adore churches, and you know, I always feel moved whenever I go into one, but you have to try and set aside your kind of emotional response and look rigorously at the facts. And it is true that some church fittings are not very good quality when you compare them to those in other churches. They may have an intangible value, and that's the other thing that I think you do have to try and have a debate about it, that we might be able to define what the artistic or architectural value of a fitting is. That's something that you can do. You can do the research on it and so on, but there will be an intangible value that people will feel attached to things, and you need to recognize that as well, and then decide, well, how much weight should we give to all these different views? And I do think that it, although I have written quite a lot of statements of significance as a consultant, and I'm not necessarily pushing the role of the consultant, but it can be useful to bring in somebody from outside, because they can be perceived by the decision-making body, which is from the PCC upwards, as being impartial, and it can be quite useful to have a fresh pair of eyes. So if you've got a very contentious scheme, I think it is worth bringing somebody in, and your architect would be able to advise on that. The architect may be able to help with a statement of significance or suggest who could come and help.
That's a really interesting point, because I wanted to ask, it sounded from at the end of your presentation there, you were saying that it's actually worth getting a statement of significance sooner rather than later, should you need it in a short, fairly urgently. At what point would you advise doing it yourself, and at what point would you advise getting a consultant in then?
Well, you obviously have to pay for consultants, so it might depend on the resources of the parish, whether they feel that they can afford to, but it might be something that they could get some grant funding for. I'm not quite sure whether there is any funding available. For example, the Architectural Heritage Fund will help with a feasibility study, and perhaps one of the other speakers or somebody in the audience might be able to tell us, is the funding available to employ a professional? But I think it's something that you could do collaboratively, and I had a little bit of experience of this when I was involved in a big project for the Religious Society of Friends, the Quakers, where the Quaker volunteers were able to do a lot of the research themselves, and they just brought in the professionals, which was a consultancy I then worked for, to pull it all together. So I think there is a way forward where parishes could do some of it themselves. They could go to the archives, get old photographs, find out about the building, and you could bring perhaps a professional in just to kind of knock it into shape so that it fits the template. So there are different ways of doing it.
There's more than one, brilliant. There's more than one way of doing it. We will try and get that answer to people about funding available for getting a statement of significance for your church building. And just tell me, are there any additional advantages to having a statement of significance? I mean, you mentioned there about funding and grants. How useful is having that statement of significance when you are looking at funding?
Well, it's an independent, and it should be, a robust statement on why this building is important. And because getting funding is a competitive business, that there isn't enough money to go round in the pots that are currently available, whether that's the National Lottery or other sources. So you've got to make the case that the building really merits it. You've usually got to make two arguments. This building is important, as part of our national and local heritage, and it needs the money because of X, Y, and Z, the roof leaks, or we're going to widen its community use. So it's part of making that argument why funding is justified.
Thank you. Alex has come up with a question, which there's been a couple of comments in the Q&A on this, but I will put the initial question to you. Marion, on the video, Kendall, could the rubble masonry be repointed with lime rather than rendering the whole building? Would this be a cost-effective option? A few points have been put after that, but just your thoughts on that, please, Marion.
Well, I don't know whether it's cost-effective. You know, you'd have to ask an architect that. But I think the point that I was making is that the current appearance of the exterior, it's not as significant as perhaps you might think, because for 500-600 years the building was covered in rough cast render, so it's only been exposed stonework since 1850, so that's what, 170 years. So a relatively small proportion of the life of the church has it been bare stonework. Yes, you could repoint it in lime mortar, and removing the cement pointing would be a good idea anyway. So I think it's something you would talk to your architect about that, definitely.
Okay, thank you, Marion. And just finally, to sum up, do you think, if there'll be people watching this thinking who may not have a statement of significance for their church, is this something you would recommend doing on some level? Would you recommend every church drawing up a statement of significance if they don't have one already?
Yeah, I think so. It's not as onerous as you might think, and it's an interesting process, and I think it's well worth doing, because it then gives you a really firm basis on which to move forwards and have more discussions about the future of the building.
Brilliant, thank you. We are just going to squeeze one more in from Clive. One local church warden asks, can we apply for listed status? When we were recently applying for grants, that was one of the stumbling blocks we came across, which was extremely disappointing. Is it possibly something for future applications? Is that something for you, Marion?
Yes, I could help with that. Anybody can apply for a building to be listed. If you go to the Historic England website, you can download a form, and they explain in a lot of detail how you go about applying for a building to be listed. And you would need to do a bit of research, a bit like a mini statement of significance, to say why you think the building should be listed. And I do help, and consultants like me do get involved in that kind of thing, but it's something that the parish could do themselves if they've got the resources, or depending on what kind of church it is.
Marion, thank you so much. Some absolutely fascinating explanation there, and some fascinating hints and tips. It was great to have your contribution, and we hope you enjoyed your visit back to Kendal Parish Church as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Emma.
Many thanks. Right. Now that we know how to understand the heritage significance of our church buildings, it's time to talk about the importance of protecting our church buildings and the communities and people who care for them, of course, should the unthinkable happen. Our next guest should be able to help us with that. Heather Ford is a church insurance consultant at Ecclesiastical Insurance. Heather, good morning.
Good morning, Emma, and thank you for that introduction. And I'm delighted to be in this conference today, and it's been a fascinating discussion so far, and some really interesting content.
I totally agree. Thank you for being with us. First of all, can you just give us a general overview of what ecclesiastical insurance is and its background, please?
Okay, I mean, obviously we're an insurance company. We've been around for 130 years, and we started as purely as an insurer for churches. And although we've now evolved into a general insurer, we remain specialists in the heritage, charity and church sector. So that's where our specialism is.
Thank you. And on that specialism, how important is it, when you're going about insuring a church building, how important is it to have that specialist insurer?
The church world, as we've explored today, is incredibly complex, and so we have that expertise through insuring church buildings for such a long time. We understand the complexities and the language, and the difficulties sometimes that actually managing the church buildings can bring, and that can sometimes bring a burden to people, as again I think we've discovered today. But churches, it's more than just the church building, it's about what goes on in the church buildings, and we've got an understanding of that and the important work that the churches do. So we have that flexibility of working with churches so that they can do their mission in whatever form that might take. And I mean, we've seen through that the House of Good report, haven't we, that the impact that the churches can make on individuals and their communities. The expertise we bring is to try and make things easier for churches. So there's lots of resources that we've got available, and it's about bringing our technical knowledge and expertise into easily digestible language that people can go away and interpret for their own church buildings and their own church activities.
Thank you. We'll get a bit. Oh, sorry, Heather. Do you want to pick up on that?
I was just going to say, I mean, what underpins our work is around enabling churches to do their mission and God's work. That's what we're here to do, is to support churches in that element.
Thank you. And just give us a bit more detail on what the All Churches Trust is. You know, how does that relate exactly to ecclesiastical insurance, and what exactly is All Churches Trust?
Well, that's what makes ecclesiastical unique in the insurance world, really, because we are owned by the charity All Churches Trust, so that underpins everything we do. So a good proportion of the profits that we generate through all of our different arms of the business get directed into the All Churches Trust, and then they can then make grants to charities and churches. And there's a wide variety of grants that are available, and if you go onto the website, you'll be able to see the sort of things that they fund. But they'll fund fabric repairs, but also fund projects that are supporting vulnerable people in the communities. There's what we call the general grant stream, and that's divided into projects up to $1 million and projects over $1 million. There's also roof alarms. Now, I know metal theft isn't a particular problem for Carlisle, but if there are churches in this conference where metal theft is an issue, then there's roof alarms, and you can get up to £2,500 towards that roof alarm. And roof alarms have been proven to be a really, really good deterrent for metal theft. And we also have what we call thematic grants, and those grants will target particular issues. So again, people on the conference may well have seen the Hope Beyond that was running last year, and that was specifically about COVID recovery. And just in the Cumbria area alone, there was £15,000 awarded to churches for that particular theme. And it's not insignificant, the amount of grants that the All Churches Trust give. Over the last couple of years in Cumbria alone, there's been over £200,000 worth of grants awarded. So I would really recommend, if there's people on this call who've got a project in mind, go on to the All Churches Trust website and see if it might work for them. Emma, the only other thing I wanted to mention on the grant funding was the Plunkett Foundation, and All Churches Trust have just given £200,000 to the Plunkett Foundation, and it's a 2-year project to provide specialist support for churches that are considering social businesses in their church buildings. And by social businesses, that could be post offices, it could be cafes, and it really is about looking at how church buildings can be used differently to help the future sustainability of them. Just the other thing I wanted to say about grant funding as well, Ecclesiastical also has its own grant funding streams, and people may have seen last year we had our Movement for Good Awards and the 12 Days of Christmas, and between those two grant streams there was over £1 million given to charity and churches.
Goodness, that's great. Some great hints and tips there on funding. Thank you so much for that, Heather. And just on ecclesiastical insurance and talking about how it supports churches to do their business, can you give me a few examples of the kind of support that's available? Because you do offer support to not just to your customers, but also to to the wider public should they need it, don't you?
Absolutely, and again, if you it's really, if you go onto our website, there's lots and lots of guidance on there. There's risk management guidance, which is around, there's lots of information about health and safety, risk management, security. There's templates that churches can download, health and safety policies, risk assessment policies that they can download and fill in. It's all about making specialist knowledge accessible to churches, and as you rightly said, it's available to everyone. You don't have to be a customer to be able to download that information. It's all freely given.
Thank you. And you know, we've said already, and I'm sure we'll say again, it has been such a tough year, hasn't it, for churches. In response to that, you launched a fundraising hub, didn't you, right at the start of the pandemic? Just briefly tell us about that, if you may.
Fundraising is always a challenging issue for churches, isn't it? And even more so with COVID, where the church doors closed overnight and giving dried up very, very quickly. So we launched a fundraising hub. Again, a lot of that is web-based resources. Again, open not just to our church customers, but to anybody, and it provides very basic information on writing grant applications, finding the right grant funders. So there's some pointers to databases. So in terms of looking for funders to do statements of significance to help fund those, you know, there may be some information there on those databases that people will be able to do a search on. There's also, we have webinars as well on the fundraising, and we've got one on tapping into social and digital media, because obviously social media has become a much more important avenue, particularly with fundraising. So there's lots and lots of resources for churches to have a look at. And we also have our Church Matters newsletter, which is a quarterly newsletter, and again, churches can sign up to that, and that'll come through into their inbox, packed full of loads of tips about maintaining churches, looking after the churches, everything a church might need to know.
Fantastic, thank you. And just finally, Heather, I know you're working with the Churches Trust for Cumbria on another upcoming event, Open Churches. Just tell us a little bit about that, if you may.
Open churches, and at this point I'm talking from Ecclesiastical's point of view, because different insurers may have a different view on open churches. But for us, we would actively encourage churches to open their church door beyond those worship hours, because there's lots of great benefits to having that the church open. Ironically, it's less of a security risk if the church door is open, because you get occasional visitors going in and out, and that unnerves thieves, because they like to know that they're not going to be going in and meeting somebody. So from a security point of view, it can actually be really helpful. But it's also an opportunity for people to go in and sit and maybe to have some quiet time. What does that closed door say to people and to the community if that church door is closed? And I give you the example in one of my own previous churches, where there was a gentleman who was having a really difficult time in his life, and he'd walked past the church on his way to jump off a bridge, and he saw the church door was open and the bells were ringing, and he came in and there was somebody to greet him, give him a cup of coffee and a biscuit, and he simply said it changed his life, it saved his life. And as a consequence, he came to church and became a church member. But that wasn't the important thing. The important thing was that church building was open, and it could have had a very different consequence for him if it hadn't have been.
Indeed, goodness, that's such a powerful illustration, isn't it? Thank you so much, Heather. And I should say that that event, Open Churches, is being held as a free webinar session on the 14th of May. That's 10:30 to 12 noon, isn't it? Heather, thank you so much for that. That is so kind of you, just give it your time. Very, very interesting session. If anyone has any questions about their church insurance or any of the resources provided by Ecclesiastical, please contact Heather directly. Her contact details will be included in that post-conference email. Right, time to take a quick break. Thank you, Heather. Time to take a quick break now. During that, we will be playing some more of the Trust videos, and we will be back with you at 12 noon. See you then.
church buildings are some of the most culturally and historically significant buildings in our county. Regular maintenance and repair of these buildings for the future. And we also need our buildings to be adaptable to change if needed. So how can conservation specialists help us look after these buildings? We find out what role they play. We also discover what's involved in quinquennial inspections and how to get the best out of them.
Quinquennial inspections are very useful documents. They are a record of the building at a particular point, and it gives them a good starting point to know where to spend their funds and where to prioritise their work.
It is a visual inspection of the church, both inside and outside, from the top of the tower right down to the rainwater gullies on the floor.
All architects deal with all types of architecture, but I think a conservation architect is somebody who has a real passion for historic buildings.
Just to do that, to take this building to its next phase of life, is a really satisfying feeling.
Visit our website to find out how to access the full series of videos. Our church buildings are some of the most culturally and historically significant buildings in our county, as well as telling the story of Cumbria's communities. A well-maintained and cared-for church will not only attract a congregation, but also the wider community. Some churches attract visitors from around the world and are a tourist destination in their own right. We discover how you can find your church's story and tell it to the wider community.
Every church has a story to tell. You just need to find that and tell that story, and tell it in a very easy way that people can appreciate. People are fascinated by the history of places, so find your own story and tell it well.
It's about having a good plan, because obviously people have scarce time, they have scarce money and resources, so it's putting together a really clear plan, finding a vision that all the people involved can buy into and say, yes, this is where we want to get to, this is what we want our church to be.
Visit our website to find out how to access the full series of videos. As an ecumenical county, our church buildings are some of the most culturally and historically significant buildings in our landscape. Whether ancient or modern, regular maintenance and repair to the construction and fabric of our buildings is essential. Over the years, well-intentioned repairs have often used cement in both renders and mortars, which we now know is not compatible with the construction and fabric of many traditional builds.
The theory was that the stronger the mortar, the better it's going to be, which obviously, as we now know, is completely the opposite.
One of the other benefits of actually taking the cement mortar out of the building is that the cement mortar was stopping the walls from breathing and evaporating the moisture out of the wall, but it was also causing erosion. Well, it already has made a difference visually, but also the walls will be drier and it will feel potentially warmer inside the church as well.
Visit our website to find out how to access the full series of videos. Our church buildings are some of the most culturally and historically significant buildings in our county. Regular maintenance and repair to the construction and fabric of our buildings is essential to conserve them for the future. We take a closer look at our church's windows and the important job of maintaining and conserving them, the challenges they can present, and the common well-intentioned cleaning mistakes to avoid at all costs.
Yeah, stained glass is a challenging thing to conserve. It's part of the historic fabric of the building, part of the building envelope. So they're all very bespoke, and for conservation that means that you'll have different challenges specific to the context of your window. Yeah, it's most important if you're thinking my windows need cleaning. Stop right there, make sure you contact somebody who is experienced in cleaning stained glass windows. Ideally for them to undertake the cleaning as well if it needs to be done.
Watch the full series of videos by visiting our website.
Welcome back. I hope you managed to catch a few more minutes of those videos there. They are just a taster for you, much more of those on the Trust's website. Right, our last session promises to be another fascinating one, as we're about to hear from the Reverend Richard Teal, President of the Methodist Conference, and Peter Aiers, Chief Executive of the Church's Conservation Trust. Now, while these two gentlemen have very different backgrounds, they also have much in common. Both are forward-thinking and both have an excellent understanding of the many issues facing church buildings right now. So I'm going to hand over to Richard and Peter, who will spend the next 20 minutes reflecting on where our church buildings are now and where they're heading in the future. I should just add, we will be opening up to questions after this, so please add them into the Q&A as and when you have them. Gentlemen, over to you.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you very much. And hello to everybody. So Richard and I are going to have a little chat really about our perspectives on historic church buildings. But I think that probably the first thing we ought to do is introduce ourselves and establish our credibility before we go. So I will always defer to you, Richard. You have the long view. So if you would like to tell everybody a bit about your background, that would be really helpful, I think.
Thank you very much, Peter, and good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to be with you today, and thank you for this invitation. I'm Richard Teal. This year, I'm president of the Methodist Conference and have been a Methodist minister for 39 years. And for most of my ministry, I've served in rural areas. And for 10 of those years, I was chair of the Cumbria Methodist District. And so it's lovely to be back, as it were, in Cumbria and be associated with it. So my credibility really, Peter, is around longevity of ministry and of ministry very much in rural settings and with rural buildings too. So I think that's where I come from and can offer a bit of perspective, I think, on the long-termness of buildings in a very different world in which we're now beginning to find ourselves.
Absolutely. Yeah, and for my point of view, I've a background in heritage, in conservation specifically. I've worked in local government. I worked for what was English House and now Historic England. I worked for the Diocese of London, and I've been with the Church's Conservation Trust since 2007. And the Church's Conservation Trust owns a collection of an ever-growing collection, might I add, of 356 historic churches across England. Now, about 85% of those buildings are in pretty remote rural areas, and we've had to learn over the 50 years we've been in existence how to care for those and to engage communities in that work. I'm also a practicing Anglican. I need to practice a lot, I think, but and also a member of Peterborough DAC, and are very involved in the church, both from a conservation point of view and from the sort of active parish point of view. Now, Richard, I was really interested in
in something you mentioned to me while we were chatting to arrange this, which was something to do with your ecumenical partnership you had in Cumbria. I just thought that would be an interesting sort of start before we head into what I'd like to talk about, which is a bit of a theological reflection. But I think that the audience would like to hear that.
All right, right. Thank you for that, Peter. I should have said in my introduction that I was also a member for a period of time of the Listed Buildings Committee for the Methodist Church. I should have mentioned that. When I was in Cumbria, the Bishop of Carlisle and myself and the URC moderator met at the very early part of my ministry, and it was out of that meeting, and it was actually within a time of meeting and hospitality and prayer, that the three of us felt at the very same time that Cumbria should become an ecumenical county. And this now is a good number of years ago, and it has become officially the first ecumenical county in the country. And it was my absolute privilege, and it was darn hard work, but it was my absolute privilege to be a real part of that and a steering part of that in its very, very early days. And the three main thrusts out of that were ecumenically working together on mission, on ministry, and thirdly on buildings. And I was very involved in the first two of ministry and of mission. And the third part, which in some ways is the harder part, was, as it were, getting on the way as I was leaving and moving for pastures new. But it was an absolute and utter joy to be part of how Christians must and need to work together, particularly in rural communities, on a totally and utterly equal basis. And you can only do that when you have got really, really good trusting relationships, which were developed through the time I was there.
No, it sounds amazing, and the communities were sharing buildings as well as an outlook as well, weren't they?
That was all sort of beginning in my time, but I was interested in festival churches. One or two people have mentioned those, and I was finding, particularly in winter, which is just a very practical thing, that a number of Anglican churches were saying to the local Methodist church, "Can we worship in your building during the winter, because yours is warm, ours isn't?" It's a very little thing, but it's actually a huge thing when you start to think about it. Absolutely. And somebody earlier on, I think it was Jayne herself, who mentioned the working together, particularly at Kirkby Lonsdale, where the fantastic working together and a great vision for the future of buildings in Kirkby Lonsdale. So it was all beginning, Peter, and I've not been there now for just over 18 months, so I don't know how all that has developed, but it was on the way. And we're much, much stronger together, particularly in rural communities, than when we are separate. There has to be that relationship and that trust for it to work.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I can see that being hugely important, and that idea of providing a resource for as many people as possible to come together is a really useful thing, especially if some of the buildings are warmer than others, which will always be attractive to people.
Yes, yeah. It's a very practical thing, but it's a very in thing, isn't it?
No, absolutely. So I wonder whether we've had a lot of descriptions of the practicalities of building management policy. Even down to statements of significance. I was enjoying watching cement render being pulled out and cement mortars being pulled out and lime going back in, which is great. But what there hasn't been time for really a lot of is any form of sort of theological reflection on the nature of the spaces that are provided by these wonderful buildings. And seeing as we've got you here, I think that would be a brilliant opportunity for you to sort of outline the nature of sacred space and provide that biblical and theological context for us.
Right, well, thank you for that. Yes, I'll just spend a couple of minutes on that, if that's okay, and also reflect, if that's all right, Peter, a little bit on where we've moved this last 18 months during the pandemic as well, because it really affects what we feel about and think about place and space and sacred space. Because place is absolutely hugely important for every single one of us. And in the Bible, at the place where the people of God, you remember, cross the River Jordan, they build a large and simple cairn. I remember how the Israelites had been displaced for many years in the wilderness, and the stones which they set up beside the river were a physical sign of God's presence, a way of saying, not just to themselves, but to succeeding generations, here we experienced the presence of God. Here God became very real to us. And of course, it wasn't the only place where they had felt God close as they had journeyed. At every turn in their lives, God had been present. But here, as they crossed the river, they paused and they set up some memorial stones, so that in future days when their children might ask, what do these stones mean? They would reply, these stones are an everlasting reminder, a reminder of the presence of God. They capture a sense of the confidence and a sense of thanksgiving in the life of the community as they come out of those many years in the wilderness. But let's fast forward that understanding and that picture to our age and to our time. Church buildings are just that for us today, a visible and tangible sign of the presence of God at the heart of just about every single community. They don't say that God resides just in these walls, not at all, but they stand as a sign that God is present in the community among us in all our joys, all our celebrations, all our complexities, and all our vulnerabilities of life. The great modern biblical scholar and theologian Walter Brueggemann wrote this: God is present in place, because those who are gathered people are embodied and are seeking by their life together to live as a kingdom community. Absolutely fantastic words. So a church building is both a sign, but it's also far more than a sign. It's not just a collection of brick and mortar, but as the New Testament reminds us, a living sign of a living God. For God's people, the church is both a sign of their life in community, a meeting place, a place of encounter, a place of renewal, a place of growth. But what about those people who are the majority, those who are, as it were, outside the church? Well, it expresses the commitment of God to their lives, as our buildings are set in communities, in cities, in towns, in villages where people live and work and engage. Now, this past year has been hugely difficult for all of us, and the pandemic has affected absolutely everyone, some more than others. Our church buildings, for the majority of them, have not only just been shut, but in many cases they've been locked also. And this has pushed many of us very, very quickly to learn new skills and new ways of communicating. Online has taken on a totally new meaning. And that's where the church has found itself, not in its building, but online. And there it's offered worship and prayer and Bible studies and business meetings and message church and much, much more. Zoom and YouTube has become a way of life for many of us. Amazingly, new people have joined us in their thousands. We've also reconnected with many, many people. Indeed, where I serve as a superintendent minister in East Yorkshire, far more people have joined us online for worship on a Sunday than we found in the pews previously. We now have a daily prayer meeting every single morning at 9 o'clock, where throughout the day over 100 people are gathering with us 7 days a week when it's convenient to them. I'm sure if we'd had one in our church buildings, hardly anybody would have turned up. Online presence has been vital and will continue to be, and we must not just return to the past and the normality of that. But although it has offered much that has been good and helpful and positive, and I would want to celebrate that, digital technology will, in my opinion, always be a good servant, but a bad master, because it runs the risk of where we started, of undermining our rootedness in tangible community and place. Now, also in my year as president of the conference, I've also been privileged to hear stories and share experiences of where church buildings have been used in new and exciting ways for mission. And indeed, where I am the superintendent minister at the moment, a brand new eco-friendly church building was completed in May, cost of £1.75 million. Due to the pandemic, we haven't been able to use it yet. But hopefully those days will shortly be changing, and the congregation is having many exciting conversations of how that building can be used in that place for mission, situated at the centre of the community where I live, to be that place where people gather and then go out to serve their community and to be a blessing to it. So it seems to me that today, and this has been mentioned a number of times, place is hugely important. And it has been throughout history, and certainly the history of the religious community. Digital technology, in my opinion, doesn't replace buildings and place, even though a number of people, certainly at the beginning of the pandemic, felt that might be the way forward. Our future, I believe, is going to be hybrid and is going to be blended, and that we need both as we move into the new future, whatever that's going to be. I hope that in some way begins to open up some really, thoughts.
That's really interesting, and actually the issue of place and the issue of digital has been something that's been very much that's worked for the Churches Conservation Trust even, and actually other places of worship. Now, obviously, quite controversially, a lot of churches closed at the beginning of the pandemic and closed their doors, and there was a huge uproar of, you know, a time potentially when we needed these buildings. That was the time that they were closed. And our perspective was, you know, obviously we were keen to obviously keep everyone safe and follow the rules and everything. But as soon as we could, we started to open up. And actually, when the other lockdowns came, we found a way to keep the vast majority of our buildings open as places of prayer or reflection. So at least there was some contact that local people could have with those buildings to help them cope, for somewhere to go on their exercise, for somewhere to sit that was still safe, because not many of our remote rural churches get a lot of visitors at any one time, but they were places there of reflection. And it seems that, you know, anecdotally, the feedback is that a lot of people really, really appreciated that there was somewhere and that the door was open. Obviously, from a practical point of view, you know, not having as many visitors as normal and not being able to host events had a huge economic impact. You know, the income was significantly hit. But actually, the digital solution was the way forward, and really we surprised ourselves with what we did. It was a genuine joy, and we started having lectures for our staff on a Thursday lunchtime. And then we decided we'd see if these lectures, because our staff are a pretty knowledgeable, interesting bunch, and to see if the wider public would be interested. And amazingly, we've had the most incredible response to our regular Thursday lunchtime lectures. And if you want to join, oh, I've pressed the wrong button and disappeared. If you want to join them, the link to our lectures are in the chat now. But the point of them is that we've gathered a new community of people like you had, in fact, that have joined us and actually joined as members as well, that we hadn't reached before through this ability. And it's been an amazing experience for them. The other thing that we did, which was definitely not digital, was when we opened the churches up again, we placed a poem in every single church, the same poem. It was a sonnet that was especially written, and the author was placed as a non, and it was actually written by our chairman, who very sadly passed away a couple of weeks ago very suddenly. So it's a very poignant thing that we placed in these buildings to allow people to visit. But we've got sort of 3 minutes left on this discussion, and I think I'd like to move on what happens next, because from our perspective, I think that I've seen that there are two schools of thought. One is that the communities will come back with a vengeance, and they'll occupy these spaces once again, and be just dying to volunteer and really coming over to really get involved again. And then this other view that actually this is going to be a turning point, a pivot, where a large number of places of worship will close because the volunteers have realized what life is like without having the burden, as they might perceive it, as following it through. I think the truth, as always, lies somewhere in the middle. I think there's going to be a lot of places which will close, which were going to struggle on for a bit longer, but hopefully there will be this resurgence as well. So I'd be interested, Richard, from a Methodist point of view, what your views on that might be.
Yeah, I agree with you, Peter. I think it'll be a blend of both. One thing we haven't mentioned, I think, through our morning are young people.
Yeah.
And I've spent a lot of time this year, unexpectedly, but via Zoom, with young people visiting particularly Methodist groups of young people. And I've been amazed at their response, just amazed. And I just can't get it out of my head, because what they have said to me in every single case, without me asking them, Mr. President, when can we get back to church? And what they mean by that is, when can we get back to the building? And I found this really quite challenging and great to hear, because when you look at young people, their lives are online. That's what they're used to. Their schooling has been online this last year. Their social lives have been online. Their church life has been online. And what they say to me is, we find it so hard to worship online. We want to get back together in our building. And they talked to me about two things, Peter. They've talked about safe space, which says to me that young people are now talking, we wouldn't have talked like this a few years ago, about the church being a safe space, but they've also talked about sacred space. In other words, for them, the screen isn't a sacred space. And this is young people talking in their teens to me and talking very openly. And I think we need to listen to young people and to hear their voice and see what they're saying to us. I've been amazed. So, but going back to closures, my observations are, where churches during the pandemic have been online, where they have been involved in their communities, they will stay open and they will possibly grow. And just where I am, if I can just mention a tiny little village, well, two tiny villages, which are just recently reopened, very, very small congregation in one in particular. Their congregation has grown by 300%.
Wow.
Why is it? Why is it? Well, the people are saying to me, we've come into church just to say thank you that we're still alive. We've come to say thank you that this church has been involved in its community. It's been interested in its community when it's been in this suffering time, and has offered to get GP prescriptions, has offered to get shopping for people, has offered to get newspapers for people, has offered to get food for people, etc., etc., has been involved in food banks. So I think where churches have been active and missional during these past 18 months, those churches will survive and move ahead and possibly attract lots of new people. Where churches have had their doors totally closed and done absolutely nothing, I think that might be a very different future.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're out of time, but I did just want to drop one last thing in to annoy Emma, because we're going over by 1 minute, is to just say that place is really important, and from a policy point of view, not just from a significance to individuals' point of view. And the government is really focused on obviously levelling up is something really important to them, but they have also defined that place is something that they're very interested in. So I think there is an opportunity, if we could keep making the case for these buildings, that they make place because of their places of communal gathering. So I'll be quiet now, Emma, to hand over to you again.
Not at all. Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you, Richard. It's absolutely fascinating to hear you kind of talk about those and bounce those ideas back and forth. So thank you for that. We are going to open up to questions now. If anyone has any questions, please just do pop those into the Q&A. We will be doing questions over the next 4 or 5 minutes, so just pop those into the Q&A now. I would be interested in just kind of exploring that a little bit more, what you guys were talking about at the end, in terms of the effects of the pandemic, and how I want to know your reflections on how much will those effects be felt in years to come, not just a few years, but decades to come, for good or for bad, those effects. Just give me your thoughts on that. Richard, give me your thoughts first, if you think, how long lasting do you think these effects are?
Yeah, thank you. I don't think there are effects which are just around for a short space of time. I think some will be, and I mean, I've spent a year on Zoom. I would have loved to have been out visiting communities around the country, around the world. I've not been able to do that physically. I've had to do it on Zoom. That hopefully that sort of thing will change. But I think where churches have really shown their commitment to their communities during a tragic, difficult period of time, those will have a lasting effect to the future. We've got out of our buildings. We've learned that we need to get out of our buildings and get into the communities. And I was very interested earlier on when Trevor Cooper was speaking. I have an absolute passion, I've always had a passion, that the church should be at the heart of the community and our buildings should be used in those particular ways, as they used to be in medieval times. And I think there'll be a lot more of that happening as time moves on. We've got out of our buildings and we've got into our communities. Absolutely vital. That must continue.
Thank you, Richard. Peter, same point to you. To hear you, it'd be great to hear your thoughts.
So it's a really interesting thing to try and predict the impact. I think that where places have got involved in the community, they've strengthened those ties, and where they haven't, I think they've been weakened. And I think the major challenge still lies out there for the heritage stroke church sector, if you like, because it's these buildings, as I was saying before, place is really important. They're about certainly the Anglican parish church has a profound relationship with place. It tells a story of absolutely everybody in that place over time. And actually, how do we continue that local ownership and engagement when there isn't so much spiritual connection? There aren't as bigger congregations, but how do we reach that community to say this building's important to you as part of your cultural heritage? And what are we doing as the sort of heritage and church bodies to support that body of volunteers to care for, as we've established today, hugely complex, rich, historic buildings? And that's kind of what we're sort of concentrating a bit on at the Church Conservation Trust. What is that infrastructure of support? What does it look like? What can we provide that supports volunteers to be able to keep these buildings in local communities? And I think there is a risk. There is a risk that who ends up caring for them, or do they fall down? So it's and I think this is a sort of a point where things could go different ways, either ways maybe.
Very interesting. Thank you, Peter. And actually, we've had a question from someone here who has said pretty much your point. I'll read the question out. Has the Church of England given up on its buildings? If so, who will care for them in the future? Just briefly, if I may, Richard, your thoughts on that, and then I'll over to you, Peter, after that. Richard first, please.
Well, I'm not a member of the Church of England, so I can't speak on behalf of the Church of England. But there was a group, and this may go part way, certainly in lockdown 1, in all denominations, and Peter knows what I'm talking about here, who felt now our buildings now have served their usefulness. We're now all online. We're doing fantastic work online. The Christian community is simply going to go online. I don't think that is the case. And I know it's not the case, and I've seen that change during the past 18 months, where people have come back, as it were, to value, yes, digital, but certainly value place, and not just the Church of England, but other denominations too, because digital, as far as I'm concerned, is a door into the room, but it's not the room itself. And if every church, if it's going to be effective in the future, must make steps forward in a digital presence. If it doesn't, it won't survive. But building roots in community, as we've said, building place, sacred place, is fundamental too.
Thank you, Richard. I love that phrase, a door into the room, but not the room itself. Peter, just over to you then, please, for your thoughts on that.
Well, I think, first of all, what is the Church of England? It's not one thing, it's many, many different things. And my experience is that, well, a lot more people working from home. I think that will continue into the future, which reinforces my point about place and how important that is. And local places have become more important and highlighted. My experience over lockdown was that people didn't go to vast mega churches online in digital spaces. They seemed to go online to their own church to hang out with their own communities online. And then as soon as the doors had opened in some places, and I'm sure this isn't the same for everywhere, just an experience I had, they couldn't wait to get back in to be in the place, because place is so significant to people. And so I don't think you can separate necessarily this issue of the building and the place from the Christian. For some people it's easy, but actually communities are very rooted, and the Anglican Church is very rooted in that there is a parish which covers every square foot of this country, and it's there. And I think it's going to continue to be important. It's how it's managed into the future. I keep saying that. How are we going to balance those things out? There may be too many buildings, as Trevor was sort of inferring before. How are those buildings managed, and what do they look like? They can't all become post offices. They can't all become shops. And actually, people do love the space that's there, but how do we manage that to happen in the easiest possible way? And it's about engaging the community in the long-term care of that building.
I think Peter makes a huge, sorry, could I just make a quick point? I think Peter makes a hugely important point about localism. And I've seen a huge rise in localism during the COVID period. And the majority of people are not going to mega churches. Very interesting is that. And they have all the resources. I preached a fortnight ago at Westminster Central Hall, and a congregation of 4,000. But the majority of people are going for local, and the technology may not be quite as advanced locally, but they want to be within their local communities. I think that's a hugely important point, Peter. It's an important point for the future.
Thank you so much, both of you, for that fascinating insight, and just listening to your thoughts on that. Reverend Richard Teal, Peter Aiers, many thanks indeed for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And our conference is almost at an end. I'd now like to hand over to Tiffany Hunt from the Caring for Cumbria's Churches Project Steering Group for some closing words. Tiffany.
Thank you very much indeed, Emma. Well, what a great morning it's been. And I would certainly like to begin by thanking you, Emma, for hosting so expertly, and all our speakers for speaking so well to time. Rob, you've kept us technically sound, always a tricky thing, so thank you very much for that. And above all, I'd really like to thank everyone for attending, your great comments, questions and debate. And indeed, I'd have to add to that suggestions for further reading. I can see that my reading list is increased quite a lot. Some really interesting and very relevant books and papers, reports have been suggested to us. I think the conference has covered a very impressive amount of ground in one morning, and it's been a valuable opportunity to exchange views and ideas. And again, we hope you've all found that helpful. I've certainly found it revelatory in many aspects, and starting with the findings of the report that Richard had discussed with Emma, produced by the National Churches Trust, about the total economic and social value of church buildings. Not always the most attractive of ways in which one looks at a place of worship, but I think increasingly, as with other similar cultural and heritage reports, it is very important to convey these messages, particularly if we're seeking to attract more government funding. I think also from what this report was saying and what Richard was discussing, it underlines the importance of churches and places of worship as community hubs, and the welfare and the well-being that they bring, and other speakers have reflected that too. Trevor presented us with a very thought-provoking set of slides and reminded us of the growing imbalance between the number of churches and the size of congregations, and the financial pressures inevitably that brings with it. I felt he offered us hope in the shape of possible government grants, of which the Cultural Recovery Fund grants in recent times have been a good example, and the increasing variety of ways in which church buildings are being used. I picked up various points about the benefits and otherwise of lottery funding, and I just thought actually those who are interested, it's worth having a quick look at the lottery fund site, as we've opened up the new grant giving process, as we've all been working our way through COVID and not needing quite so much emergency funding. But there's a good example of a church receiving a grant from the lottery on the North's website, where a community came together to revitalise a historic churchyard in Rossendale, Lancashire. And there's a rather good description of the benefits that that's provided by Rachel Gildard, the Secretary of Valley Heritage. So we're always very interested at the lottery in looking at church applications and being able to provide what advice and support that we can. I think the other thing I would like to thank Jayne particularly. Much credit is due to her for all the work that she's put into developing this conference and the project that this is the outcome. I think one of the things that, from what Jayne was saying, that was a highlight for me was to emphasise the key role played by volunteers in the care and maintenance of church buildings. I know today we've got a mix of professionals and volunteers, but I know from my own church here in Cartmel just how vital the volunteer support has been and remains. I thought also this generated perhaps the inevitable interesting comments about hibernating or festival churches. This has been very much on the agenda of the Carlisle DAC, on which I and a number of other people here today sit. And I think that's going to be quite a challenge in looking ahead. I've had experience of the benefits of drawing on Marion's skills in preparing statements of significance. And I think her excellent slides and video illustrated some of the key components. And I think it really does, from what we've seen and heard, just emphasize the importance of statements of significance, even if you're not applying for a grant at the moment. It's amazing what you learn about your church or place of worship. And this is obviously something that denominations beside the Church of England place equal importance. Heather updated us very helpfully about the work of the Ecclesiastical Insurance, and just touching again on funding, mentioned the Plunkett Foundation and the grant available for exploring the future use of church buildings, and also the Open Churches project and the many benefits of keeping our churches open. Finally, Richard and Peter, I felt, spoke passionately and very persuasively about their work with churches and the value of sharing resources. The importance of place was beautifully expressed by Richard, along with the benefits that digital technology bring, but making the important point that it runs the risk of losing our rootedness in the community. And I entirely agree that I think post-COVID, our future will be hybrid. But I was very encouraged to hear from Richard that young people are actually keen to get back into the church, which they see as a safe space and a sacred space. And I think older generations will feel very much the same. And it's also reflected, I think, I'm sure we don't relate to this, the importance of localism and our local communities. So finally, I would just like to say on behalf of the Caring for Churches steering group, we do hope you've all found this conference to be useful, and there'll be, I hope, things that you will be able to follow up, whether it be on the sustainability reset, some of the contacts that you might have made online this morning. I think we're all too aware of considerable challenges facing our places of worship of whatever denomination, but I hope that this conference has left you feeling that there are real opportunities and there are lots of shared resources out there. And I hope perhaps even from this conference today, some of you will be able to make contacts that will help you in the future. So I'll hand back to you, Emma. Thank you.
Tiffany, thank you. And that brings our event to a close. A huge thank you to all of you for attending today. As Tiffany said, I hope you found it interesting and inspiring. A big thanks to all the panelists for contributing their time and knowledge, and to all of you, the attendees, for your great questions. Also, many thanks to the National Lottery Heritage Fund for supporting the Caring for Cumbria's Churches project. And finally, to the Churches Trust for Cumbria and all those involved in making this event happen today. It would be wonderful to get your feedback on this event. I know some of you have very kindly put some of that into the chat. To that end, a survey will pop up for you when this conference finishes. If you have the time to fill that out now, it would be hugely appreciated, as this helps us evaluate the day for the National Lottery. Alternatively, a link to that survey will also be sent out in the post-conference email with oodles of other information from today, which Jayne will be sending out to you next week. And finally, if you would like further information or have any queries about this event, please contact Jayne at the Churches Trust for Cumbria. Thank you to all of you for your time. Enjoy the rest of the day. Bye-bye.